Hey legends! Welcome to The Fiction Wizard. Buckle up for today's story. Remus Lupin arrived at Privet Drive with James's will, and did not leave without Harry. A like and subscribe goes a long way. Now let's jump in. Chapter 1, The Will. The rain had been falling since before dark. Remus Lupin stood at the end of Privet Drive and felt it soak through his coat, through the wool jumper beneath it, through the skin that had been cold since 4 o'clock that morning when the news had hit him like a physical blow and dropped him to his knees on the floor of his rented room in Edinburgh. He'd been kneeling there for a long time. He didn't know how long. At some point the candle had burned out and he'd been kneeling in the dark, and then it was light outside, and then the light changed, and eventually he'd stood up because there was something he needed to do. He had James's will. He'd had it for 6 months. James had pressed the sealed envelope into his hands at a Sunday dinner in September, laughing, calling it morbid housekeeping, telling Remus, just hold on to it, you're the responsible one, Moony, we all know it's you, and Remus had taken it home and put it in the iron box under his bed where he kept things that mattered, and he hadn't thought about it again until 4 o'clock this morning when the world had ended. He'd thought about it then. The will was in his inside coat pocket now, wrapped in oilskin against the rain, pressed flat against his chest where he could feel it every time he breathed. Number 4 Privet Drive was lit up from inside, the warm yellow glow of ordinary lamps in ordinary rooms. A television flickered blue in what he assumed was the sitting room. A neighbor's cat watched him from beneath a hedge. The whole street smelled of wet tarmac and someone's dinner going cold. He walked up the front path. The doorbell made a cheerful 2-note sound that struck him as obscene. For a moment nothing happened. Then the television volume dropped and he heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, the footsteps of someone large and unhurried who owned the floor they walked on. The door opened on a man who was, in fact, exactly as large as his footsteps had promised. Big across the chest, thick through the neck, with a mustache that seemed to be trying to compensate for something. He looked at Remus the way people look at something unpleasant that has found its way onto a clean surface. No thank you, the man said, and began to close the door. Remus put his hand flat against it. The man blinked. He was not accustomed to flat-out refusal, that was legible in his face immediately, the slight recalibration, the offense rising. Excuse me, my name is Remus Lupin, Remus said. His voice came out quieter than he'd intended but steadier. I was James Potter's closest friend. You are Vernon Dursley, Petunia's husband. I need to speak with you and your wife. I will not take long. Vernon Dursley's face did a complicated thing. The name Potter moved through him visibly, a flinch, quickly buried, replaced by a stiffening of the whole body that was almost territorial. We don't have anything to do with. Where is Harry? Remus said. The question came out like a stone dropping into still water. Simple, flat, final. Vernon Dursley's mouth closed. He stared at Remus for a moment with something that might have been calculation underneath the bluster, and then he stepped back from the door, not an invitation, exactly, but an opening. Remus walked through it. The hallway was aggressively normal. Coat hooks, a mirror, a small table with a bowl of car keys. A framed photograph of Vernon and Petunia on what appeared to be a cruise ship, both of them squinting into sun. A larger photograph of a baby who could only be Dudley Dursley, round-faced, pink, deeply unimpressed by the world. Petunia appeared at the end of the hallway. She'd always been angular where Lily was soft, sharper where Lily was warm, same pale coloring, same bone structure around the eyes, but assembled differently, like an architect had used the same materials to build 2 completely opposite buildings. She was wearing a floral housecoat and had clearly been doing something domestic when the bell rang. She went still when she saw Remus. Not surprised, exactly. More like a person who has been waiting for a knock on the door they'd hoped wouldn't come. Petunia, he said. Mr. Lupin. Her voice was clipped and careful. She had always been careful around James's friends, around anything touching that world, treating magic the way some people treat illness, something you could catch if you weren't vigilant. How did you find us? James knew your address, Remus said simply. He was your sister's husband. He kept it in case of emergency. He paused. This is an emergency. Vernon moved to stand beside his wife in a manner that was clearly meant to convey a united front. Now look here, Harry, Remus said again. Where is he? Is he sleeping? Is he hurt? He's perfectly fine, Petunia said, too quickly. I'd like to see him. You'd like, Vernon started. I have James Potter's will, Remus said, and he reached into his coat and drew out the oilskin-wrapped envelope and set it on the small hallway table beside the bowl of car keys. The envelope sat there quietly in the warm light of the ordinary hallway and somehow managed to dominate the entire room. Signed and dated the 14th of September of this year, witnessed by 3 parties, sealed in magical contract. I have a copy lodged with Gringotts Bank and another with the office of Madame Longbottom, who serves on the Wisengamot. The will names Sirius Black as Harry's primary guardian and myself as secondary guardian. Petunia had gone very still. Harry Potter is my ward, Remus continued, and his voice didn't shake at all, which surprised him, because inside he was a long way from composed. Legally and magically. I am here to collect him. For a moment the hallway held a silence that had genuine weight to it. The television murmured in the next room. Rain tapped against the window beside the door. Then Vernon Dursley said, loudly, absolutely not. Vernon, Petunia began. No, Vernon said, voice rising to fill the hallway with its preferred volume, which was clearly loud. No, no, no. You people do not waltz into my house and start making demands. I don't care what your piece of paper says. I know perfectly well what those people's wills are worth. My wife told me what they're like, the whole lot of you, waving your sticks about and thinking you can just, wands, Remus said mildly. What? We call them wands, not sticks. Remus reached into the pocket of his coat and set his wand on the hallway table beside the will. He didn't point it at anyone. He didn't make any kind of threatening gesture. He simply set it down and looked at Vernon Dursley steadily. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm not here to argue with you. I have come a very long way on a very bad day and I would like to see Harry and make sure he is well, and then I would like to have a civil conversation about what happens next. Vernon stared at the wand. His mustache was doing something agitated. I'll sue, he said. It was clearly his most powerful threat, the nuclear option. I'll take you to court. You can't just come in here and, my legal representation is a goblin named Sharpfong who has been practicing contract law for 300 years, Remus said. You're welcome to try. The silence that followed was different from the first one. Petunia broke it. He's upstairs, she said. Vernon turned to her. Petunia, he's upstairs, Vernon. Her voice was quiet but it had steel in it. She looked at Remus and there was something in her face that he couldn't quite parse, not warmth, nothing so simple, but something complicated and human and raw. Second door on the left. The nursery. Remus took his wand back from the table. He left the will. The nursery was small, painted in a hurried yellow that was slightly the wrong shade, like whoever had done it had bought the paint in a rush and regretted it after. There was a cot against the far wall and a chest of drawers with a small lamp on it that was still on, casting everything in a low amber glow. Harry was in the cot. He was on his back, one fist clenched beside his cheek, dark hair sticking up in approximately 7 directions, wearing a too large sleep suit with yellow ducks on it that had clearly belonged to Dudley First. He was asleep, chest rising and falling with that total dedicated abandon that only very small children manage, like breathing is the most important project in the world. On his forehead, just visible at the edge of his hairline, was a scar in the shape of a lightning bolt. Remus stood in the doorway for a long time. He had been holding himself together through sheer forward momentum since Edinburgh, purpose as armor, purpose as engine, there is something to do therefore you must do it, and standing here in this wrong yellow room watching James's son sleep, the armor developed a serious structural crack. He was dead. James was dead. Lily was dead. He had seen them both precisely 6 days ago, James at the front door of Godric's Hollow, hair in his eyes, ink on his hand from something he was writing, complaining happily about a Quidditch match on the wireless. Lily leaning over James's shoulder in the doorway, laughing at something Remus said, pressing a cup of tea into his hands before he could protest. 6 days. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment, hard, until the wave of it passed. Then he crossed the room to the cot and looked down at Harry up close. The child stirred. Not waking, just shifting, the instinct-level awareness of small creatures who have learned that sounds in the night mean something. His head turned slightly. His nose wrinkled. "Hello," Remus said, very quietly. "It's all right. I'm Remus. I'm your father's friend." His throat tightened. "I'm your family. Or the closest thing left to it." Harry's eyes opened. They were James's eyes in Lily's face, startling green, sharp, even half-fogged with sleep, and they found Remus in the dim room with an immediacy that was unsettling in a child so small. Not fear. Not confusion. The gaze was steady and considering, the gaze of someone taking stock. Then Harry lifted both arms. Not reaching for comfort, exactly. More like, demanding. A very small person who had decided what he wanted and was communicating this in the clearest available terms. Remus picked him up. Harry grabbed a fistful of his coat collar with one hand and pressed his face against Remus's neck and made a sound that was almost but not quite a sigh, a sound of such uncomplicated relief that it broke something open in Remus's chest that he suspected might not close again for a very long time. He stood there in the yellow room with James Potter's sun warm and solid against his chest and let himself, just for a moment, fall completely apart. It was brief. He couldn't afford long. But it was honest, and it was necessary, and when it passed he felt emptier in a way that was slightly cleaner, the way a wound is cleaner once it's open. He wiped his face with the hand that wasn't holding Harry. Harry, for his part, had not let go of the coat collar and did not appear to be planning to. "All right," Remus said. "Let's go sort out your aunt and uncle." Petunia and Vernon were in the sitting room, the television now entirely ignored, sitting in the rigid posture of people having a disagreement they've agreed to shelve temporarily. They both looked up when Remus came down the stairs with Harry. Harry looked at them with the same stock-taking expression he'd used on Remus, and then apparently found them less interesting, and turned to examine the bookshelf instead. "I want to explain what I'm proposing," Remus said, sitting down in the armchair across from the sofa because his legs were beginning to remind him that he had not slept in approximately 36 hours. He settled Harry in his lap, where Harry immediately began trying to determine whether the buttons on Remus's coat were detachable. "And I'd like you to listen, because it's reasonable and because it protects you as much as it protects Harry." Vernon had gathered himself somewhat. He'd been doing tactical breathing in Remus's absence, clearly, he'd pulled his offense back and wrapped himself in something more considered. "I want to see that will," he said. The document." "Of course." Remus nodded toward the hallway. "It's on your table." Vernon retrieved it with great ceremony, carrying it back and breaking the oilskin seal and unfolding it with the energy of a man who expected to find something wrong with it. He read it. His expression moved through several stages. He handed it to Petunia. Petunia read it more carefully and more quietly. The will was 6 pages, handwritten by James in the cramped left-leaning script Remus knew so well it made his eyes sting, and it was clear and specific and had the weight of proper magical contract behind it. The letters themselves had a faint luminescence, the mark of blood sealing, which meant the document was as binding as any law in the wizarding world. James had named Sirius first and Remus second and had written, in the margin beside Remus's name in a hand that looked slightly different, more hurried, like an afterthought written later, because he's the one who'll actually show up. "Love you, Moony." Petunia set the will down in her lap. "He's named you," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Both of us. Sirius first, but Sirius is, Remus stopped. He didn't want to explain Azkaban right now, couldn't face it, couldn't make himself parse what Sirius had done or what it meant without risking the collapse of everything he was using to stay upright. Sirius is unavailable. So the guardianship falls to me. And Dumbledore? Petunia said. Remus looked at her. What about Dumbledore? Petunia met his eyes. She had Lily's cheekbones, Lily's jaw, and in this moment, something that might have been Lily's directness. He was here. An old man with a long beard. He left a letter with the baby. With Harry. She glanced at Harry, quickly, and then away. He was here before you. Remus's hands went still on Harry's back. When, he said, and his voice had changed. This evening. Before dark. She hesitated. He said Harry was to stay here. He said there were protections, blood protections, because we share blood, Lily and I. Something flickered in her face at Lily's name, something she shut down immediately. He made it sound as though it was settled. It isn't settled, Remus said. He's Dumbledore, Vernon said, though with slightly less force than usual. Even Vernon Dursley, who had strong opinions about most things, seemed to find Dumbledore difficult to simply dismiss. Yes, Remus agreed. He is. And the blood protection theory has merit, I won't tell you it doesn't. But it doesn't override a legal will. It doesn't override guardianship rights. And it doesn't, he paused, finding the words. It doesn't mean Harry has to grow up here. The words landed in the room and sat there. Petunia looked down at the will in her lap and then up at Harry, who had successfully detached one of Remus's coat buttons and was examining it with profound scientific interest. He'd be safer, Remus said, more quietly. With someone who knew his parents. Who can tell him who they were? He watched Petunia's face. Lily would have wanted that. It was a low blow and he knew it and he used it anyway because it was also true. Petunia's jaw tightened. You don't know what Lily would have wanted. I knew her for 7 years, Remus said gently. She talked about you. She missed you. Even at the end, she missed you. For just a moment, one single unguarded moment, something cracked in Petunia Dursley's face that was so raw and so painful that Remus looked away from it out of sheer instinctive respect. She recovered almost immediately, pulled herself back together with practiced efficiency, but the crack had been there. Vernon, to his credit, noticed. He put a large hand over his wife's and said nothing, which was probably the wisest he'd been all evening. What do you want from us? Petunia asked finally. Her voice was completely controlled again. To discuss this reasonably, Remus said. To give you a chance to be part of this decision rather than have it made around you. The will is binding, I want you to understand that. If I wished to, I could leave here tonight with Harry and there is nothing legally you could do to prevent it. But I don't want to take him in the night like a theft. I want, he stopped. Tried again. He's a child who's lost his parents today. I'd like the transition to be as calm as possible. For his sake. Vernon and Petunia looked at each other. One of those long married looks that carries an entire conversation in it. He was no trouble, Petunia said at last, and it cost her something to say it, he could see that. He's been perfectly quiet. He hasn't, she glanced at Harry again, the glance quick, almost unwilling, like looking at something bright. He hasn't cried. He's in shock, Remus said. Babies feel more than people give them credit for. Harry, as if to illustrate this point, chose this moment to hold up Remus's button and offer it to Petunia with great solemnity. Petunia looked at the button. She looked at the child holding it, green eyes, James's nose, Lily's mouth. The lightning bolt scar. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone doing something genuinely hard. Then she reached out and took the button from Harry's small hand and said, in a voice that was completely steady, "I'll get his things together." It took 40 minutes. Remus sat in the armchair with Harry and listened to Petunia moving around upstairs, efficient, organized, the sounds of someone who found activity easier than sitting still. Vernon had retreated to the kitchen and was making tea with great aggressive purposefulness, and eventually appeared with 2 mugs that he set down without comment. Remus looked at the mug. He was reasonably sure Vernon Dursley had never made anyone else tea in a charitable spirit in his life, and he found he was oddly moved by it. He drank it. It was too strong and slightly too sweet. Harry fell asleep again in his lap sometime around the 20-minute mark, warm and heavy, one fist still loosely curled around the lapel of Remus's coat. Remus found himself looking down at the sleeping face, the scar, the dark hair, the impossible eyelashes that were Lily's, and making a series of very quiet, very serious promises to himself that he did not put into words because words made things solid and he was not ready for solid yet. Vernon Dursley, who had been standing in the doorway of the sitting room with his mug of tea and clearly building up to something, finally said, "What happened last night?" The attack." Remus looked at him. Vernon had the look of a man who didn't actually want to know but had decided that not knowing was worse. "Voldemort came to their house," Remus said. He didn't soften the name, he'd never understood the habit of fearing a name. "He killed James and Lily and then he tried to kill Harry. The curse, the killing curse, it didn't work on Harry. We don't fully understand why. Voldemort is gone, or at least diminished. Harry survived." Vernon stared at the sleeping child. "He killed what did you call it? He deflected the most powerful dark curse in existence," Remus said. "He's 15 months old." He looked down at Harry himself. "James and Lily died protecting him. That kind of love, it's not metaphorical, in our world. It creates something real. Something that holds." Vernon sat down heavily on the sofa. For a moment he looked less like a large man full of self-importance and more like a person who had just been made to understand that the universe is stranger and more terrible than he'd accounted for. "He'll be safe," Vernon said. "Where you're taking him?" "I will make sure of it," Remus said. It was not the same as yes. It was better than yes, in its way, it had his weight behind it rather than just a word. Vernon seemed to hear the difference. He nodded once, slowly. Petunia came downstairs with a large bag, a muggle bag, practical nylon, packed with the items a 15-month-old requires, clothes, a soft toy that was clearly Dudley's by origin but had been included anyway, a blanket that was obviously new and was clearly, if you were paying attention, the nicest thing in the bag. She set it in the hallway and came to the doorway of the sitting room and looked at her nephew sleeping in the arms of a man she barely knew. "You'll tell him about Lily," she said. "Not a question. A condition." "Yes," Remus said. "The good things," Petunia said. Her voice had something in it that she was working very hard to keep level. She was kind. She was annoying about it sometimes, she was too much, she stopped. She was kind. She was the best person I knew, Remus said quietly. Except for James, and they're impossible to compare. Petunia turned away from the doorway abruptly and went to the kitchen. The sound of water running. Remus stood carefully, adjusting Harry against his shoulder without waking him. He picked up the bag with his free hand. Vernon appeared at the end of the hallway, and they stood there in the entrance of the ordinary house with its ordinary photographs and its car keys in a bowl, and something passed between them that was not warmth exactly but was something, acknowledgement, maybe. The understanding that they were both, in their own separate ways, trying to do right by a child who had already survived something unsurvivable. "I'll be in contact," Remus said. "You have my word." Vernon gave a single stiff nod. Remus opened the front door. The rain had eased while he'd been inside, dropping from a downpour to a light insistent drizzle, and the street gleamed with it, orange under the street lamps. He stood on the front step with Harry warm and sleeping against his shoulder and James's will in his inside pocket and a muggle nylon bag over his arm, and looked out at Privet Drive. From down the street, he caught it, a glimmer, very faint, like something reflective half hidden beneath an invisibility cloak. The specific quality of stillness that wasn't natural. Someone watching. Remus's jaw tightened. He had expected this. Dumbledore moved pieces at speed when he had to, and he'd had the whole evening. There would be watchers. There might even be an intervention waiting somewhere down the road, some magical barrier, some gentle but immovable obstruction dressed up as reason. Dumbledore was very good at making obstruction feel like reason. Remus shifted Harry on his shoulder, buttoned his coat one-handed, noting absently that the bottom button was gone, and stepped off the front step into the drizzle. He walked straight down the middle of Privet Drive. He passed the shimmer of the invisible watcher without pausing. He heard, or imagined he heard, a quiet intake of breath, recognition, possibly. He didn't look. Didn't slow. Didn't reach for his wand. He walked with the particular quality of steadiness that came not from confidence but from the complete absence of doubt, and there is a difference between those two things, and anyone watching would have felt it. Harry slept through all of it. One fist curled in Remus's collar. Completely unbothered. At the end of Privet Drive, at the mouth of the junction where the street lamps ended and the dark road began, Remus stopped. He shifted Harry to one arm. Harry made a small sound of protest and grabbed tighter, and reached into his pocket for his wand. He stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the evening, the weight of the will against his chest, the weight of the child on his shoulder and all that the child meant and all that the child would mean and all the days ahead that were going to be so much harder than this one and so much better. "All right," he said to the dark and the drizzle and the empty street behind him and the invisible watcher and Dumbledore somewhere in Scotland sleeping soundly under the confidence of certainty. "All right," he said again. "I have him." He turned on the spot. The darkness swallowed them both. Chapter 2. The cottage at the edge of the map. The cottage existed in the way that certain things exist when someone who loved you built them with that specific purpose, not grandiose, not impressive, just entirely and stubbornly there. It sat at the end of a dirt track in the Brecon Beacons, tucked against a hillside like it had grown there, stone walls the color of old pewter, a slate roof that had survived 60 Welsh winters and looked prepared to survive 60 more. James had inherited it from his father, who'd inherited it from his, and it had been sitting empty for 4 years because James preferred Godric's Hollow and Sirius preferred London, and neither of them ever got around to selling it because it was the kind of place you kept for reasons that didn't fully make sense until you needed it. Remus had the key. He'd had it for 2 years, since James had pressed it into his hand after a difficult month and said, casually, as if it were nothing, "Go use the cottage for a bit, Moony, the quiet will do you good," and Remus had gone for a week and come back and quietly kept the key ever since because returning it had never come up and he'd needed something to hold on to that felt like permanence. He'd been there twice since then. He knew where the spare candles were, and that the kitchen tap ran cold for a full minute before warming up, and that there was a loose flagstone in the hallway that would absolutely catch your foot in the dark if you forgot about it. He did not forget about it. He stepped over it automatically, Harry still against his shoulder, and felt his way to the kitchen table and set the nylon bag down and stood in the dark for a moment letting his eyes adjust. Outside, the Welsh hills were a particular shade of dark blue that meant no moon, overcast, and the wind was doing what Welsh wind does in November, which is treat every available surface as a personal grievance. Lumos. The tip of his wand lit the kitchen in warm white and Remus looked around at stone walls and an old iron range and a table with 4 chairs and copper pots hanging from a ceiling beam and felt, for the first time since Edinburgh, something loosen in his chest. He was safe here. More importantly, Harry was safe here. The cottage had residual Fidelius charm, not activated, the secret keeper was gone with Fleamont Potter these 4 years, but layered protections James had never bothered to undo, the kind of passive warding that cost nothing to maintain and so was simply left running. Anyone who wanted to find this place would have to know it existed first, and the number of people who knew the Potters had a cottage in the Brecon Beacons was very small. Remus set his wand on the table, lit end up, and took stock of Harry. Harry had been awake for approximately the last 40 seconds of their apparition, and had expressed his opinion of side-along travel at 15 months with a look of profound betrayal directed at the side of Remus's head. He was now examining the kitchen with the methodical thoroughness of a structural surveyor, turning his head from the copper pots to the range to the stone walls with his small face arranged in an expression of serious professional interest. "I know," Remus said. "It's not much to look at." Harry pointed at one of the copper pots. "That's a pot," Remus said. He set Harry down on the kitchen table, keeping one hand on him because the table was high and Harry was the age where gravity was a concept he treated as a suggestion rather than a law. "Don't touch yes, you can hold the spoon." "That's fine." Harry had located a wooden spoon from somewhere on the table, holding it with the concentrated energy of someone who has found precisely the tool they needed, and began to apply it to the surface of the table experimentally. Remus looked at the bag. Then at Harry. Then at the bag again. He realized, almost no idea what he was doing. This was not a new feeling. His life had been a long catalogue of improvised solutions and creative interpretations of the managing, but it usually applied to things like managing his condition or managing his finances or managing the full moon, and not to the logistics of caring for a small person who required specific quantities of milk at specific intervals and apparently had strong opinions about wooden spoons. He opened the bag. Petunia had packed it with the focused precision of someone who knew exactly what was necessary, and he found himself genuinely grateful for it: bottles, formula, a changing kit, for changes of clothes, the soft toy, a rabbit, he noted, considerably loved-looking, one ear more worn than the other where it had clearly been held, the blanket, a muslin cloth, a small book with thick cardboard pages that had pictures of animals on them. He also found, tucked down the side, a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. It was a feeding schedule, written in Petunia's angular handwriting. Morning bottle at 7. Lunch, soft foods, no nuts, no honey. Afternoon bottle at 3. Dinner at 5:30. Bedtime bottle at 7. He likes the rabbit held a certain way or he'll throw it. He doesn't like being put down when he's not ready. He sleeps better with the lamp on low. Remus read it twice. Then he folded it back up very carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He would think about Petunia Dursley later, when he had capacity for complicated feelings. Right now he had a 15-month-old on a kitchen table who was attempting to conduct a percussion experiment and an iron range that needed lighting. He lit the range with his wand, which made Harry drop the spoon in order to point at the fire with an expression of intense discovery. "Warm," Remus said. "Yes. Don't touch." Harry continued to point at the fire with the energy of someone reporting an important development to mission control. "I know," Remus said. "I see it too." The first night was a controlled disaster that only became uncontrolled once. Remus warmed a bottle, which took 3 attempts because he got the temperature wrong twice, too cold, then alarming, then just right, which Harry confirmed by seizing the bottle with both hands and the righteous focus of someone who has been waiting for this specific moment for some time. He got the rabbit oriented correctly on the second try. Petunia had not specified the orientation, but Harry communicated his preferences clearly through the medium of throwing the rabbit onto the floor. He found the bedroom, small, under the eaves, with a low beam that caught him on the forehead once and that he thereafter treated with respect, and the cot that had been there since James was a child, dusty but intact, which he cleaned with a charm his mother had taught him when he was 7 and which he had never expected to use in this context. Harry went down in the cot with the rabbit and the lamp turned low and went to sleep with a directness that Remus found quietly extraordinary. No protest, no distress, just the steady dropping away of consciousness the way a tide goes out. As if he trusted. As if, in some inarticulate deep-down way, he had made a decision about Remus and was comfortable with it. Remus sat in the chair beside the cot for a long time after Harry slept. He didn't sleep. He wasn't going to sleep, not tonight, probably not tomorrow night. His body had filed sleep under optional for the foreseeable future. He sat in the chair with his wand across his knees and the lamp burning low and let himself be present in the quiet, which was the closest to peace he was likely to get. He thought about James. He tried not to and did it anyway, the way you probe a sore tooth, not from masochism but from the compulsive need to check that it's still real. James at 17, flying so fast that the broomstick's tail caught fire and he came down laughing. James at 21, at his wedding, with Lily's hands in his and an expression on his face like he couldn't believe his own luck. James at 24, standing in the door of Godric's Hollow with ink on his hand and the wireless crackling in the background. James dead at 21 years old, because Sirius had told Voldemort where they were. The thought dropped into his mind like a stone and sat there, the way it had been sitting there since the news, and Remus let it. He didn't try to examine it or make sense of it. He understood that there were some facts that would never make sense, that sense was simply not on offer. Sirius had been in Azkaban for 18 hours now. The Ministry had moved fast, faster than Remus, faster than anything. Peter Pettigrew was dead, blown apart in a Muggle street, 12 Muggles dead with him, and Sirius had done it, and Sirius had been the secret keeper, and Sirius was in Azkaban, and Remus had loved Sirius like a brother for 14 years. He sat with all of this in the dark, the way you sit with something that won't resolve. Then he looked at Harry sleeping, the dark hair and the lightning bolt and the small fist curled around the rabbit's worn ear. "You're why I'm upright," he thought at the sleeping child. "You should know that." The uncontrolled part of the night happened at 2 in the morning, when Harry woke up crying with the sudden total crisis of someone who has remembered, mid-sleep, that the world is wrong. Not hungry, not wet, not tired, just crying, the deep shuddering cry of a child with no language for grief, and Remus picked him up and walked him around the small bedroom and then down the dark hallway and into the kitchen and back, talking quietly, "It's all right, I've got you, I know, I know, I know," until the crying eased and Harry put his face against Remus's neck with the exhausted surrender of someone who has done all they can and is now relying on someone else to manage the rest. They sat in the kitchen chair by the range until 5 in the morning, Harry asleep against his chest, Remus awake and watching the fire. It was, in the way of terrible things, also strangely all right. He sent his Patronus to Minerva McGonagall at 7 in the morning because she deserved to know Harry was safe before she heard it from Dumbledore, and because he trusted her, and because he suspected she was going to be important in what came next and he wanted to be the first to talk to her. His Patronus was a wolf. It always had been, which he'd found bitterly appropriate in his more self-pitying moments and had since made a kind of peace with. The wolf loped away through the wall of the cottage with his message, "Harry is safe and with me. I have the will. I need to speak with you before Dumbledore does," and Remus turned back to the kitchen where Harry was in the high chair he'd found in the back bedroom and assembled with magic and 2 wrong turns, eating porridge. Harry ate with the concentrated determination of someone working against a deadline, both hands involved, the spoon technically present but treated as decorative. He had James's approach to most physical tasks: go fast, worry about mess later. He had Lily's precision in his eyes, that absolute attention to whatever was in front of him. Remus watched him eat and felt the complicated mathematics of the situation arranging themselves behind his eyes. He had Harry. He had the will. He had lodged copies with Gringotts and with Augusta Longbottom's office, that had been done by Owl at 6 this morning, the copies he'd prepared weeks ago because James was right, Remus was the responsible one, the one who made copies of things and kept them organized in iron boxes under beds. He had, for the moment, the advantage of having moved first. What he did not have, a long-term plan, a clear understanding of what Dumbledore would do next, any idea how to manage the full moon in 3 weeks with a toddler in the house, money beyond the modest but functional amount that sat in his Gringotts vault, or anything resembling certainty about anything. What he did have, the cottage, the will, Harry, and the absolute bone-deep conviction that he was doing the right thing. That would have to be enough to start. Harry finished the porridge, considered the bowl, and then looked up at Remus with porridge on his chin and both cheeks and held up the spoon in what was either an offering or a declaration of victory. "Yes," Remus said. "Very good." Harry threw the spoon on the floor. Right, Remus said. Of course. McGonagall's response came at 9:30, not a returned Patronus but the woman herself, appearing at the cottage door in her travelling cloak, her tartan scarf, her hat pinned at the angle of someone who has left quickly and without full regard for appearances, which for Minerva McGonagall meant something. He let her in without a word. She came in and took off her hat and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Harry, who was on the flagstone floor with the wooden spoon and the rabbit and a pot lid he'd somehow acquired, and stood there looking for a long time. "He's all right," she said. It came out quieter than her usual register. "He's fine," Remus confirmed. "Slept through most of the night." McGonagall looked at Harry for another moment and then transferred her gaze to Remus and took him in with the same thoroughness, his grey coat, the shadows under his eyes, the controlled quality of his stillness that was not calm but was the thing that holds when calm has gone. "Sit down, Remus," she said, not unkindly. "I'm fine. You look like you've been hit by a bus and are performing wellness for an audience of one." She pulled out a chair. "Sit down." He sat. She put the kettle on, which she found through sheer competence without being shown where anything was. "He came to see me last night," she said, her back to him. "Albus. He told me Harry was at Privet Drive, that the blood wards would protect him, that it was all arranged." A pause. "He seemed very confident." "He usually does." "Yes." She set mugs on the counter. "He didn't mention the will." "He may not have known about it," Remus said. "James didn't, he didn't make it common knowledge. He was 21. People don't think about wills at 21. They're things for later, for when they're old." His voice didn't crack, which he was grateful for. He wasn't old. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. "Then, he told me at the school, you know. James, when he was 7. When I came to deliver his letter. He told me very seriously that he intended to be an Auror and catch dark wizards and be famous. And his mother nearly fell over with embarrassment and he was completely unbothered." She laughed, brief and painful, more sound than feeling. He was so entirely himself from the very beginning." Remus looked at Harry on the floor, who had arranged the rabbit, the pot lid, and the spoon into a triangle formation and appeared to be conducting some kind of survey of the result. "He is too," Remus said. McGonagall brought the tea and sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around her mug. "Albus will come, Remus. You understand that. He won't let this lie." "I know. He believes the blood wards are necessary. Not as a permanent solution, he sees the bigger picture, he always does, and I think," she paused, choosing words with care. "I think in his picture, Harry at Privet Drive is a chapter with an end. Difficult but finite. And then Hogwarts and the rest of it." She looked at him. "He's not wrong about the blood wards. The protection Lily made is real," Remus agreed. "I know. I've thought about it." He turned his mug on the table. "But there are ways to maintain blood protection without the child being housed with people who don't want him. Petunia's blood is the anchor, not the roof over his head. If Harry visits, if there's contact, the charm can be maintained without," he stopped. "Without Harry growing up where nobody loves him." He didn't say it but it sat between them anyway. McGonagall heard it. He could see her hearing it. She looked down at her tea. "You're right," she said quietly. "But that argument requires Albus to admit the blood protection isn't the whole reason." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the Welsh hills were grey-green and enormous, and the wind was doing its thing, and a crow landed on the stone wall by the track and stood there being a crow at them. "He wants Harry away from the world," Remus said. "Until he's old enough to be useful." McGonagall's jaw tightened. "That's a very uncharitable interpretation." "Is it wrong?" She didn't answer immediately. Harry, on the floor, had lost interest in the triangle and was now focused on the flagstone with the loose edge that Remus had stepped over in the night. He was pushing at it experimentally, testing the give of it, and the small face had the look of someone doing legitimate engineering assessment. "Don't touch that one," Remus said, and Harry looked up at him and then deliberately pushed the flagstone again. "He's James's," McGonagall said, and there was such naked fondness in her voice that it cut right through everything else in the room. "He is," Remus said. "All the way down." McGonagall straightened. She set her mug down and folded her hands on the table and looked at Remus with the expression that meant she was about to say something that mattered. "I'll support you," she said. "Whatever Albus says. If it comes to the Wisengamot, if there are hearings, whatever process this takes. The will is legal and binding and Harry's welfare is the only thing that ought to matter." A pause. "I am telling you this in my private capacity, not as deputy headmistress. Albus he is my friend, and he is usually right, but, not this time," Remus said. "Not this time," she agreed. She picked up her mug again. "What are you going to do about the full moon?" "I was hoping you'd ask." Remus looked at her steadily. "I need Wolfsbane potion. I've already written to Severus." McGonagall blinked. Whatever she'd been expecting, it wasn't that. "Severus Snape? He's the best potions brewer alive," Remus said simply. "And he's going to spend the rest of his life being insufferable about it, which is a price I'm prepared to pay." He hated James. Yes, but he respected Lily. And Harry is Lily's. Remus set down his mug. "He'll do it. He won't enjoy it, but he'll do it." McGonagall looked at him for a long moment with an expression that moved through several rooms before settling on something like reassessment. "You've thought about this more than you've let on," she said. "I've been thinking about it since Edinburgh," Remus said. "I had a long night." Snape's response to the owl arrived at noon. It was a single line, on plain parchment, in the small precise handwriting of a man who has decided to be economical with everything including ink, where and when. SS Remus read it and felt something that was not quite gratitude but lived in the same neighborhood. He wrote back with the address and a date 2 weeks out, which gave him time to establish the cottage properly before dealing with the particular atmospheric event that was Severus Snape in a confined space. In the afternoon he took Harry outside. The hillside behind the cottage was steep and brown-grassed and the wind was cold but not cruel, and Harry, placed on the ground in a thick coat and knitted hat that kept trying to slide over his eyes, stood for approximately 4 seconds before dropping decisively onto his bottom and beginning to examine the grass with both hands. He picked up a pebble and assessed it. He picked up a larger pebble and compared the two. He picked up a third pebble that was apparently the worst of the three and threw it with the committed energy of someone clearing bad data. Remus sat on a rock and watched him and felt the strange soft weight of the afternoon on him, the cold air and the wide sky, and Harry busy in the grass, alive, well, safe, here. James's son, with James's hair and James's approach to the physical world, sitting in the November hillside collecting rocks with the focus of a natural philosopher. He thought, involuntarily, about Sirius. He always thought about Sirius, that was the problem, 14 years of it, 14 years of Sirius being the first person he thought of when anything happened, good or bad. 14 years of Sirius would laugh at this and Sirius would hate that and I need to tell Sirius, and now the habit was still running even though the destination had turned to something he couldn't look at directly yet. He thought about Sirius in Azkaban and felt a helpless complicated fury that had nowhere to go, so it sat in his chest and burned quietly. Harry turned around and held up a pebble. It was a specific pebble, rounded, slightly pink, the nicest of the collection. He was holding it out to Remus. Remus leaned forward and took the pebble from Harry's small cold hand and turned it over in his fingers. Harry watched him with great attention, apparently checking that the gift was being properly appreciated. "Thank you," Remus said. "It's the best one." Harry considered this verdict and apparently agreed, because he turned back to the hillside and resumed his survey. Remus turned the pebble over in his fingers and let himself feel, just for a moment, that it was possible to do this. That he was not necessarily going to break under the weight of everything bearing down on him. That there was something on the other side of grief that wasn't absence. He held the pebble in his palm and watched Harry work. The wards registered a new presence at 4:30. Not a breach, an arrival at the outer boundary, the magical equivalent of someone standing at a closed gate rather than pushing through it. Remus felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure, a subtle shift in the quality of the space around the cottage. He was back inside by then, Harry fed and drowsy in his arms again, the lamp on low. He knew who it was before he checked. He went to the window and looked out at the dirt track leading down to the road. The figure standing at the end of it was tall, robed, silver-haired, unhurried. He had his hands folded in front of him and was looking at the cottage with the mild, patient expression of a man who has all the time in the world and is not accustomed to being kept waiting. Albus Dumbledore did not push through the wards. He waited. Which was itself a message: I am being polite. I am giving you the opportunity to welcome me. This is courtesy, not limitation. We both know I could come through if I chose. Remus looked at Harry, who had fallen asleep again, and carried him carefully upstairs and put him in the cot and tucked the rabbit in beside him and stood there for a moment looking down at the sleeping face. I won't be long, he said quietly. He went back downstairs, put on his coat, and walked out the front door and down the track to where Dumbledore stood at the boundary. The evening light was going fast, the hills going purple in the dusk, and Dumbledore stood in it with his silver hair loose and his half-moon glasses glinting and his eyes, behind the glasses, doing what Dumbledore's eyes always did, seeing everything, weighing everything, making you feel simultaneously understood and categorized. Remus, he said warmly. Headmaster, Remus said. You know why I'm here. Yes, Remus said. He stopped at the boundary, stayed on his side of it, which was deliberate, and they both knew it was deliberate. And I imagine you know why I'm not going to invite you in. Dumbledore's expression was kind. It was always kind. That was the thing about him, the kindness was real, that was the maddening part. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had decided, long ago, that the requirements of the greater good were something he alone could calculate correctly, and that this justified decisions that looked, from the outside, like cruelty. The will is legitimate, Dumbledore said. I've spoken with Gringotts. I know. James was thorough. Something moved in the old face, grief, real and present, there and gone. He always was, when it mattered, regardless of appearances. Yes, Remus said. The wind moved between them, cold and indifferent. I am not your enemy, Remus, Dumbledore said. Nor Harry's. Everything I have done has been in service of his protection. I know that too, Remus said. I believe you believe it. Dumbledore tilted his head slightly. But you made a decision for Harry last night, Remus said, without consulting the will, without consulting me, without consulting anyone with a legal claim to him. You put him in a house where he wasn't wanted and walked away confident that you'd arranged things correctly. He kept his voice even. I'm not angry with you for caring about his safety. I'm telling you that the way you went about it was wrong, and that the legal guardianship stands, and that Harry is staying with me. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The kind eyes were doing their work, reading him, measuring him, assessing the situation with the computational thoroughness of a mind that had been working problems for a century and a half. The blood protection, he began, can be maintained through contact with Petunia without Harry living there permanently, Remus said. I've thought it through. I've looked at the research on how the charm anchors and what sustains it. It doesn't require a fixed address. It requires Lily's blood to remain in the world and for Harry to know that fact. He paused. I'm going to write to Petunia and suggest visits. She won't refuse. She's not, he thought about the feeding schedule tucked in his coat pocket. She's not unfeeling. Dumbledore was quiet. The light was almost gone from the hills now, just a thin cold line of orange along the western ridge. "He will need to go to Hogwarts," Dumbledore said at last. "When he's 11. He will need to be prepared. There is still danger in the world, Remus, even with Voldemort diminished. There are those who served him who have not answered for it. There is a prophecy." He paused. "Harry's path is not ordinary." "No," Remus agreed. "But he's 15 months old. His path right now is pebbles and porridge and learning how flagstones work." He met the old eyes steadily. "He'll be ready when he needs to be. I'll make sure of it. But I'm going to let him be a child first." Another long silence. Dumbledore reached into his robes and produced a small card. It was, Remus saw, a Floo address. He held it out across the boundary and Remus stepped forward and took it. "If you need anything," Dumbledore said. "Resources, protection, information. The offer stands regardless of our disagreement." He looked at Remus over his glasses with an expression that had something complicated in it, not defeat, not quite, but the acknowledgement of a man who has met a wall where he expected a door. "He has James's stubbornness, you know. I always found it," a pause. "Admirable. Eventually." He turned and walked away down the track without looking back. Remus stood at the boundary and watched him go, the silver hair disappearing into the dusk, and felt the specific quality of a battle not won but not lost, a held line. He turned and walked back up to the cottage. Light in the windows. Warm. Inside, upstairs, Harry was still sleeping with one fist around the rabbit's worn ear, entirely unbothered by prophecies or blood protections or the most powerful wizard in Britain standing in the lane. Remus sat down in the chair beside the cot and reached into his pocket and turned the pink pebble over in his fingers, and somewhere in the process of doing that he fell asleep in the chair and slept, genuinely and deeply, for the first time in 2 days. In the morning Harry woke him up by patting his face with one small hand and saying, with enormous clarity, something that was unmistakably up. Remus opened his eyes. Harry was standing in the cot with both hands on the rail, looking at him with the expression that meant expectations were being communicated. "All right," Remus said, his voice rough with sleep. "All right. I'm up." He picked up Harry and went downstairs to start the day. Chapter 3, The Ivory Tower Moves. 3 weeks passed. They were the strangest 3 weeks of Remus's life, which was saying something given that his life had included a werewolf bite at age 6, 7 years of secret keeping at Hogwarts, and one particularly memorable incident in 5th year involving a switching spell, a jar of marmalade, and the Slytherin Quidditch captain's robes. But those weeks in the cottage and the Brecon Beacons had a quality he couldn't quite categorize, grief and purpose running in parallel, both absolutely real, neither cancelling the other out. Harry turned 16 months old on the 21st of November, which Remus acknowledged by making a small cake from a recipe he found in the cottage's kitchen drawer, handwritten on a card in Euphemia Potter's looping script. The cake was technically a success. The frosting went sideways. Harry ate it with both hands and got it in his hair and seemed entirely satisfied with the occasion. Remus took a photograph. He had a muggle camera he'd bought in the village at the bottom of the track, a small market town that asked no questions and sold good bread and had a post office that handled both regular and, if you knew how to ask, magical correspondence. He'd been down to it twice, and the woman at the post office counter had looked at his address on the third morning and simply said, "Ah, the old Potter place," with the tone of someone for whom nothing was very surprising, and handed him his letters. He was getting letters. From McGonagall, regular and informative, the kind of letters that described the weather at Hogwarts and the health of various staff members and happened, incidentally, to contain detailed intelligence about what Dumbledore was and wasn't doing. She had a gift for burying the important thing in the middle of a paragraph about Professor Sprout's new greenhouse initiative. "Albus has been in contact with the Ministry twice this week, I believe regarding guardianship statutes. Sprout's venomous tentacula project is really coming along, you might want to have your documentation in order." From Augusta Longbottom, whose letters were considerably more direct, the Wisengamot Guardianship Subcommittee has been convened. Dumbledore has friends on it. So do I. Be ready. From Gringotts, confirming that the will had been formally registered and that one Remus John Lupin was the recognized magical guardian of one Harry James Potter, pending any challenge brought under Article 7 of the Guardianship and Succession Act of 1942, which allowed interested parties to contest a will's provisions within 60 days of the testator's death. 53 days left. He pinned that number to the inside of his head and kept it there. And from Snape, brief, no salutation, no pleasantries, I will arrive on the 14th. Have coffee. Strong. SS. Snape arrived on the 14th at exactly 11 in the morning, which was when he'd said he'd arrive, because Snape was punctual the way some people are aggressive, as a statement about the world and his relationship to it. He appeared at the end of the track in a black cloak that the Welsh wind immediately treated with the same indifference it showed everything else, and walked up to the cottage with the particular quality of stillness that Snape carried with him everywhere, the stillness of a man who had learned very young to take up as little space as possible and had since made it into something more like a weapon. Remus opened the door before he knocked. Snape looked at him. Then past him, into the kitchen. Harry was on the floor with a set of wooden blocks that Remus had found in the cottage's back bedroom, James's, presumably, from when he was small, painted in faded primary colors. He had built a tower of 4 blocks, which was apparently the limit of structural integrity, because it fell over as Snape appeared in the doorway and Harry looked at the wreckage and said something that was not quite a word but conveyed the essence of "well, that's annoying." Snape looked at Harry for a long moment. His face was doing nothing that a casual observer could have named, but Remus had known Severus Snape since they were 11 years old and there was something moving behind his eyes that was not nothing. "He has her eyes," Snape said. "Yes," Remus said. "Come in." Snape came in and set a box on the kitchen table, potion supplies. Remus saw, the unmistakable smell of it, clean and sharp and chemical. He unclipped his cloak and hung it on the back of a chair with the precision of someone who has rules about where things go. Remus made the coffee. Harry, on the floor, looked at the new person in the kitchen with his usual stock-taking expression. He picked up one of the fallen blocks. He considered it. He held it up in Snape's general direction with the universal offering gesture. Snape looked at the block. He looked at Harry. The something behind his eyes moved again. "I am not sitting on the floor," Snape said. Harry appeared unconcerned by this position and continued to proffer the block. "He does that," Remus said. "He gives you things. The best things, specifically, he seems to sort them. It's a compliment." Snape's expression suggested he was unsure how to process being complimented by a 16-month-old. He reached down and took the block from Harry's hand with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating unfamiliar territory, and Harry immediately went back to rebuilding the tower, apparently satisfied. Snape set the block on the table and looked at it. Then he sat down and accepted his coffee and said nothing for a while. "The wolfsbane," he said finally. "I've prepared the first course. You take it in the 7 days before the moon, you know the protocol. There's enough here for 3 months. That's, thank you, Severus. That's more than I asked for." "It's more than you deserve," Snape said, but the venom was thin on it, more habit than feeling. However, he looked at Harry, who had rebuilt the tower to 5 blocks and was eyeing a 6th with cautious ambition. "The child requires a stable guardian. You being incapacitated once a month does not serve that goal." He turned back to his coffee. "Pure pragmatism." "Of course," Remus said. "Don't make it something it isn't." "I wouldn't dream of it," Remus said, and meant it, and they both understood each other, which was the closest they'd ever managed to warmth and was, honestly, enough. The tower fell. Harry said his not-quite word again. "He'll be at Hogwarts in 10 years, Snape said. He'll be sorted into Gryffindor and he'll be insufferable about it." "Almost certainly," Remus agreed. His father was insufferable. His father was wonderful, Remus said, quiet and direct, and let the word sit. Snape's jaw tightened. He looked at the middle distance for a moment. Then, yes. Well. He drank his coffee. His mother was better. They were different kinds of wonderful, Remus said. Not comparable. Another silence. Harry abandoned the blocks in favor of investigating Snape's cloak, which had an interesting fringe he'd apparently only just noticed. He grabbed a section of it and pulled experimentally. Don't, Snape said. Harry looked up at him with James's expression, the one that meant interesting. Let's find out what happens if I do it anyway. Don't, Snape said again, more firmly. Harry let go of the fringe and patted the cloak instead, apparently deciding this was a reasonable compromise. Snape looked down at the hand patting his cloak. Something crossed his face very quickly and was gone. He has her hands too, he said, very quietly. It was not addressed to Remus. It might not have been addressed to anyone. Remus looked out the kitchen window at the Welsh hillside and gave the moment its privacy. The letter from the ministry arrived the next day. It was formal parchment, heavy stock, sealed with the ministry crest, addressed to Mr. R.J. Lupin, proposed guardian, case file HP 1182A. Remus opened it at the kitchen table while Harry ate his morning porridge and read it with the careful attention he gave to anything legal. The summary was this: a formal challenge to the guardianship provisions of the Potter will have been filed by interested parties. The letter didn't name them, but it didn't need to, under Article 7 of the Guardianship and Succession Act. A preliminary hearing had been scheduled before a subcommittee of the Wisengamot for the 9th of December. Remus was required to appear with documentation supporting his claim. Harry was required to be present. Remus read it twice. Set it down. Looked at Harry. Harry had porridge on his nose and was examining the ceiling with the specific focus of someone who has spotted something structurally significant. Right, Remus said. He wrote 3 letters before 9 o'clock. To McGonagall, the hearing is the 9th, I need your testimony in writing, anything about James's intentions regarding guardianship, anything you know about the will. To Augusta Longbottom, we have a date. I need your guidance on the subcommittee and who sits on it. To Gringotts, to Sharpfong specifically, formal challenge filed. I need you in London on the 9th. Then he sat back and thought about what else he needed. He needed to be calm. He needed to be right. And he needed to be, without any equivocation, the most prepared person in that room. He reached for the next piece of parchment and began to write out his case. Augusta Longbottom arrived 2 days later. She was a small woman who moved as though she were considerably larger, with a formidable hat that appeared to be a fixed feature rather than an accessory, and she came up the track with her cane making decisive contact with the ground at regular intervals, communicating via walking alone that she had places to be and was choosing to be here. She looked at Remus across the kitchen table with sharp eyes under iron-gray brows and said, without preamble, the subcommittee has 7 members. Dumbledore has influence over 3 of them, direct influence, former students, people who trust him. 2 are independent and can be worked on with evidence. 1 is Griselda Marchbanks, who is 87 years old and has never been influenced by anyone in her life and will decide based purely on the law, which is either very good news or very bad news depending on how clean your documentation is. It's clean, Remus said. Show me. He spread the documentation on the table. The will, the Gringotts registration, the copy of the relevant statutes he'd worked through over 3 nights with reference texts he'd oled from a wizarding law library in Cardiff, his written argument for how blood protection could be maintained without fixed residence. Augusta worked through it in silence. Harry, who had taken one look at Augusta and apparently decided she was interesting, crawled to her feet and pulled himself upright using her robes and stood there examining her hat from below with intense academic curiosity. His grandmother would have adored him, Augusta said, without looking up from the documents. She would have spoiled him rotten and taught him everything she knew, Remus agreed. Yes, well. That's what grandmothers are for. Augusta turned a page. Your argument about the blood protection is good. It's also slightly ahead of the published scholarship on sacrificial charm mechanics, which means Dumbledore will challenge the theoretical basis. I've prepared for that. Remus slid another document across. I wrote to Bathsheba Babbling at Hogwarts. She's the ancient runes professor, but she's also the foremost living expert on blood magic theory. She sent me a 3-page analysis supporting my interpretation. Augusta looked up. You wrote to Babbling, she said. Last week. Something moved in Augusta's face that might have been the first cousin of impressed. She looked back at the documents. You've done the work. Harry's worth the work, Remus said simply. Harry, still clinging to Augusta's robes, had now reached up toward the hat with clear intent. Don't you dare, Augusta said, and Harry froze with his hand 6 inches from the hat, apparently genuinely startled by this response, and then slowly and very deliberately lowered his hand and went back to examining the hat from a respectful distance. Augusta looked down at him. Good decision, she said. I appreciate good decisions. She sounded faintly approving in the way that stern people are approving, which is actually more affecting than ordinary approval. Harry beamed at her. Remus watched this and felt something shift very slightly in the shape of things, not just the legal case, but something larger. Harry gathering people. Harry being, already, the kind of person other people wanted to stand next to. James had been like that. The most natural thing about James was the way people leaned toward him, drawn in not by performance but by genuine warmth. Harry had it too, raw, instinctive, already present in the way he offered pebbles and received them, the way he took stock of people and seemed to reach a verdict of yes, I think you'll do, that was so frank and unpretentious it was almost impossible to resist. He'll be fine, Augusta said, and she was looking at Remus now, not Harry, with an expression that was direct and not unkind. At the hearing. Don't let them make you nervous. I'm not nervous, Remus said. You look nervous. I look like someone who hasn't slept more than 4 hours consecutively since November 1st, he said. It's not the same thing. Augusta conceded this with a brief nod. I'll be there. In the gallery, not on the subcommittee. I have a conflict of interest because I'm on record supporting the will's registration. But I'll be there, and there are things a person can communicate from a gallery. She closed the documents and stacked them neatly. One more thing. Yes? Dumbledore will be present, she said. Not on the subcommittee, he can't be, he's an interested party. But he'll be in the room. He's very good at being in rooms. She fixed Remus with a look. Don't let him reframe the argument. The argument is simple, the will is legal, you are named, Harry's welfare supports the named guardianship. Every time the conversation moves away from those 3 facts, bring it back. Don't let him make it about prophecies or protections or the greater good. Make it about James's wishes and Harry's well-being and the law. 3 facts, Remus said. 3 facts, Augusta confirmed. She stood, cane finding the flagstone, and looked down at Harry, who was back on the floor with the blocks. He needs a winter coat, she added. Something proper. That thing he's wearing has seen better days. It was Dudley Dursley's, Remus admitted. Then it has never seen good days, Augusta said, with authority, and left. McGonagall came the day before the hearing. She didn't bring documents, she'd oiled those ahead, a clean formal letter of testimony that laid out, in her precise measured prose, what she knew of James Potter's intentions regarding his son's upbringing, what she'd observed of Remus's character over 7 years at Hogwarts and in the years since, and a single devastating paragraph at the end about the nature of the Potter will and what it said about James's priorities that she'd clearly written last, probably late at night, probably after sitting with a glass of whiskey for a while. She came in and looked at Harry and said, "Has he had a haircut?" with the tone of someone raising a concern. "He's 16 months old," Remus said. James's hair was unmanageable at 16 months too, McGonagall said, more to herself than to Remus. Euphemia used to try to comb it and she made a gesture. Anyway. She sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands. Tell me how you're feeling about tomorrow. I've told you how I'm feeling, Remus said. I'm prepared. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. She looked back with the expression that had survived 30 years of students trying to deflect personal questions with competence. I'm frightened, he said, and the word came out plainly, without the armor of fine around it. Not of the hearing. Of what it means if we lose. Harry's been here 3 weeks and he knows where the loose flagstone is. He knows the lamp needs to be on low. He has a spot on the hillside where he keeps his best pebbles and he goes to check on them every morning like a little farmer checking his livestock. His voice had something in it he let stay there. He's not a piece on a board. He's a person. He's been a person for 3 weeks in my house and I'm frightened. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. The wind moved against the cottage windows. Harry was upstairs napping, the cottage quiet around them. When James was in his 5th year, McGonagall said, he and Sirius, and I suspect you and Peter were involved, though you all maintained deniability, transfigured every chair in the Slytherin common room into a different species of tortoise. Remus said nothing. It took 2 days to sort out. The tortoises kept transfiguring back at inconvenient moments throughout the week. A pause. I gave him detention for a month. I also told Dumbledore privately that it was the most technically accomplished transfiguration I'd seen from a student in 20 years. She looked at her hands. I didn't tell him that often enough. That he was extraordinary. She looked up. You know where that comes from, the fear of saying too much, getting attached. It has a logic to it. But it's wrong. I know it's wrong, Remus said. Then don't make the same mistake with Harry. She said it with the directness of someone who has been sitting with this thought for a while and has decided it needs to be said out loud. Don't hold back from him because it makes you less afraid. Love him the full amount. He deserves the full amount. The kitchen was very quiet. I already do, Remus said. McGonagall nodded once, briskly, like a conclusion reached. Good. Then go to that hearing and win. The 9th of December was cold and grey, the sky over London the colour of old pewter, and Remus arrived at the Ministry of Magic with Harry in a new winter coat, deep blue, properly fitted, not Dudley Dursley's, and his documentation under his arm and Sharpfang the Goblin at his left shoulder, 3 feet 4 inches of absolute legal certainty in a suit that probably cost more than Remus's annual income. They went through the public flue into the atrium, and Remus walked through the Ministry's echoing halls with Harry on his hip and the Goblin at his side and felt the Ministry's particular atmosphere settle around him, that specific combination of institutional grandeur and low-level anxiety that was the Ministry's permanent weather. People looked at Harry. Of course they did. The wizarding world had spent 5 weeks in a state of celebrating Harry Potter's survival, of calling him the boy who lived in breathless whispers, and here was the boy in question, in a new blue coat, looking back at the people looking at him with the equanimity of someone who hadn't asked for any of this attention and had decided to remain unbothered by it. One witch stopped dead in the middle of the corridor. Her hand flew to her mouth. Harry looked at her. She had on a green scarf with a pattern on it that he apparently found interesting, because he pointed at it. He's real, the witch breathed, to no one in particular. He's real, Remus confirmed. He's also pointing at your scarf. She touched her scarf with shaking hands and said, he can have it. He can have anything. Anything he wants. Her eyes were full. My son is alive because of, thank you, Remus said gently, moving them along. Really? Thank you. They went through 3 more corridors and a lift and 2 security checkpoints. The second checkpoint was a senior Auror who took one look at Harry and had to compose himself quite visibly, going professional with some effort, and into the Wizengamot chamber which had been requisitioned for the subcommittee hearing. The room was smaller than the main chamber, stone walls, tiered seating, 7 chairs at the front for the subcommittee. The gallery held perhaps 20 people. Remus saw McGonagall immediately, upright and still in the 3rd row, and Augusta Longbottom beside her, hat and cane, the specific posture of someone who has decided where they stand and planted themselves there. He saw 3 ministry officials he didn't recognize, a woman he thought might be from the Prophet, and, yes, Dumbledore. Dumbledore sat in the gallery's 2nd row, robes midnight blue, hands folded, looking calm and benign and utterly certain of himself. He met Remus's eyes across the chamber and nodded, once, in the way of someone acknowledging a colleague before a meeting. Remus nodded back and sat down at the table designated for him, settling Harry in his lap, and laid out his documents. The subcommittee filed in at 9 o'clock precisely. 4 wizards, 3 witches, ages ranging from late middle to very old, faces carrying the specific quality of people who deal in legal decisions for a living, which is a combination of deliberateness and fatigue that looks almost like wisdom. Griselda Marchbanks was in the center chair. 87 years old, white-haired, built like a bundle of sticks held together by sheer opinion, she sat down and arranged her parchment and looked over the chamber with eyes that had absolutely nothing apologetic in them. The hearing opened with formalities, case number, parties present, documents lodged. Remus noted 2 of the subcommittee members exchange a glance when the Gringotts representative was announced alongside Sharpfang, both of them recalibrating their posture slightly. Gringotts' involvement communicated something simple: this person has resources, this person has prepared, this person is not going to be moved by procedural pressure. The first hour was documentation review. Dry, methodical, the kind of process that had its own momentum and required nothing of him except answers to direct questions and the occasional clarification. He gave them cleanly. Sharpfang sat beside him and offered legal precision when needed, speaking in the flat certain tones of someone for whom the law is a matter of mathematics, not argument. Harry sat in Remus's lap through all of it, initially focused on the strap of the document folder, then on the gallery, then on the subcommittee members, working through each face in turn with his standard assessment process. He reached Griselda Marchbanks and stopped. Marchbanks, Remus noticed, had also stopped looking at her parchment and was looking at Harry. Whose boy is he? One of the subcommittee members, older, wizard, reading glasses, the one Augusta had identified as leaning toward Dumbledore's position, said, in the tone of a man making a conversational point, not asking a genuine question. That's really what this is about, isn't it? James and Lily Potter are gone and everyone has an opinion about where their child should be. The will has an opinion, Remus said. That's the only opinion that's legally relevant. James Potter was 21 years old, the wizard said. He was young, he was hasty, he named friends as guardians the way young men do, without fully. He was 21 years old, Remus said, and he and his wife were living under threat of death. He knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote that will. He was thorough. He was deliberate. He named 2 people he trusted with his son's life because he understood that his life was in genuine danger, and he was right, and he died, and his will stands. The chamber was quiet. Furthermore, Remus continued, keeping his voice level, James Potter was not the only one who made provisions. Lily Potter kept a separate letter, lodged with Gringotts, stating her agreement with the will's guardianship provisions. She signed it 3 days after James wrote the will. He slid the copy across the table. She was also 21. She was also thorough. He felt Dumbledore in the gallery in a way that was not sight or sound but something more like atmospheric pressure. He didn't look. The wizard with the reading glasses looked at Lily's letter. Something shifted in his face, not a reversal, but a hesitation, which was a start. Marchbanks spoke for the first time. Her voice was dry and precise and gave nothing away. The question before this subcommittee is narrow. The will is not in dispute, it has been registered and verified. The question is whether the named guardian meets the standard of fit guardianship under the Act. She looked at Remus over her parchment. Mr. Lupin. You are a werewolf. The word dropped into the chamber the way that word always dropped, with a particular quality of silence after it, the silence of people deciding how to arrange their faces. Yes, Remus said. Under the Dangerous Creatures Restriction Act of 1965, a registered werewolf requires approval from the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures before assuming custody of a minor. Have you sought that approval? I filed the application on November the 2nd, Remus said, and produced the document, the morning after I collected Harry from Privet Drive. I received provisional approval on the 6th. I have also provided documentation from a licensed healer confirming my condition is managed with wolfsbane potion, which I have been obtaining from a qualified potions brewer. He slid these documents across as well. I anticipated this line of inquiry. A brief silence. Marchbanks picked up the approval document. Read it. Set it down. You filed on November the 2nd. Yes. The day after. Yes. She looked at him for a moment with those nothing apologetic eyes. Then she made a small note on her parchment. From the gallery, from where Dumbledore sat, there was no sound. But the pressure changed, just slightly, the way a room changes when someone in it adjusts their expectation. The hearing went on for another hour. Questions about finances, he had James's bequest, modest but sufficient, detailed in a codicil to the will, questions about living arrangements, the cottage, wards documented, space adequate, questions about Harry's current condition, healthy, well-fed, developmentally on track, as confirmed by a letter from a healer he'd taken Harry to see in the second week. And then the wizard with the reading glasses, Aldrich Bones, Remus remembered now, Augusta had named him, tried one more time. There is the question, Bones said, carefully, of stability. Mr. Lupin, you are, forgive me, a man who has lived somewhat irregularly. Employment has been inconsistent. You have no fixed address of record prior to, I have a fixed address now, Remus said. The cottage is not technically your, Harry Potter's estate inherited the cottage on November 1st, Remus said. As Harry's guardian, I manage his estate. The cottage is Harry's. Which means it is, for all practical purposes, our home. He looked at Bones steadily. I live there with him. Every morning he checks on his pebbles on the hillside. Every evening I read to him from books his grandmother's hands touched. He knows the house and the house knows him. He paused. If stability is what you're measuring, I submit that 3 weeks of consistent care from a person who loves him represents more stability than the alternative, which was leaving him overnight on the doorstep of relatives who have never met him with a note and a hope. The gallery was very, very quiet. Bones opened his mouth and closed it again. Marchbanks looked at Remus. Then she looked at Harry, who had been patient through the whole proceeding and was now examining the gold seal on one of the documents on the table with the focused interest of a numismatist. Then she looked at the rest of the subcommittee and said, in the flat certain voice of someone ending a discussion rather than opening one, I've seen enough. The documentation is complete, the provisional approval is in order, the will is registered, and the guardian appears to be exactly what he claims to be. She folded her parchment. We'll deliberate. Recess for 30 minutes. The subcommittee filed out. Remus sat back in his chair for the first time in 2 hours and let himself breathe. Harry looked up at him and said, clearly and with total confidence, something that was very nearly good. Remus looked down at him. Did you just, he started. Harry said it again. Unmistakably, absolutely, with the decisive authority of someone making an assessment, good. Yes, Remus said, and his voice had something in it that he didn't try to manage. I think so too. From the gallery, he heard a sound. He looked up. Minerva McGonagall, who had survived 30 years in a profession that required the maintenance of strict professional composure, was pressing her fingers against her mouth and staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone who has decided the ceiling is very interesting right now, her eyes suspiciously bright. Augusta Longbottom was looking at Harry with an expression that was purely and uncomplicatedly fond. And Albus Dumbledore, in the second row, was looking at Remus with an expression that was harder to read, not defeat, not anger, but something that was perhaps the beginning of genuine reassessment. The look of a man who has been very certain for a very long time encountering something that certainty hadn't accounted for. He inclined his head, very slightly, toward Remus. Remus held his gaze for a moment, and then looked away, back to Harry, who had successfully detached the gold seal from the document and was now wearing it on his finger like a ring and examining it with profound satisfaction. The subcommittee deliberated for 22 minutes. The ruling was 4-3 in Remus's favor. Marchbanks read it in 12 words, flat and final as a door closing, guardianship confirmed. The will's provisions stand. This matter is closed. Remus sat very still for a moment and let the reality of it land. Then he picked up Harry, gold seal and all, and stood, and walked out of the Wisengamot chamber into the ministry corridor, past the Auror who had to compose himself, past the witch with the green scarf who had gone home hours ago, through the atrium and the flue and out of the ministry entirely. Into the cold London air, grey sky overhead, Harry warm and heavy and alive on his shoulder. 4-3, Remus said to the sky. Harry grabbed his collar. It counts, Remus told him. A win is a win. He turned on the spot and took them home. Chapter 4, The Dog at the Door. The owl arrived on a Tuesday. It was not a ministry owl, not one of McGonagall's sensible barn owls, not the Gringotts eagle that Remus had come to recognize by its particular attitude of institutional superiority. This was a small, battered tawny owl that landed on the kitchen windowsill at 7:30 in the morning with the manner of something that had flown a very long way and had strong opinions about it. It had a strip of parchment tied to its leg that was so small Remus almost missed it. He untied it carefully. The owl accepted a piece of toast crust from Harry's breakfast plate and departed without ceremony. The parchment had 4 words on it, in handwriting he hadn't seen in 6 weeks, handwriting that looked nothing like itself, cramped, strange, the letters pressed too hard into the parchment like the hand holding the quill had been shaking. He wasn't the traitor. No signature. No address. No date. Remus read it 3 times standing at the kitchen window in the grey December morning and then sat down very slowly in the kitchen chair and read it again. Harry, in his high chair, had a piece of toast in each hand and was looking at Remus with the specific quality of attention he deployed when he sensed something in the room had changed. Remus set the parchment on the table. He wasn't the traitor. 6 weeks ago he had understood the shape of things. Sirius had been the secret keeper. Sirius had betrayed the Potters. Sirius was in Azkaban, and Peter was dead, and James and Lily were dead, and the world had arranged itself into a terrible logic that held together even when you looked at it from different angles, even when it made you sick to look at it, because terrible things could be perfectly logical. Except. He thought about Peter. He thought about Peter the way he'd been avoiding thinking about Peter, small, nervous, always slightly out of his depth but choosing to be there anyway, choosing them, choosing James's reckless loyalty and Sirius's bright burning confidence and Remus's quiet steadiness as the things he wanted to be shaped by. Peter who had been a better friend than anyone gave him credit for, including Peter himself. He thought about the detail in the ministry report he'd read at McGonagall's suggestion 2 weeks ago, the report that described the street in Muggle London where Sirius had supposedly cornered Peter. 12 Muggles dead. Peter's finger found in the wreckage, which was how they knew he was gone. A finger. 1 finger. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he looked at the 4 words on the parchment again. Harry held out a piece of toast. Not right now, Remus said absently. Then, thank you. Yes. All right. He took the toast and didn't eat it and looked at the parchment and thought hard. He wrote to McGonagall. Not about the parchment, not yet, not until he understood what he was dealing with, but asking a specific question: had there been any formal investigation into the events of the 2nd of November beyond Sirius's arrest? Had anyone interviewed witnesses independently? Had anyone looked at the scene in Godric's Hollow with forensic attention rather than the assumption of a conclusion already reached? McGonagall's response came that evening. It was a single sentence embedded in a paragraph about the December snowfall at Hogwarts. The speed of the arrest concerned me at the time and concerns me more now. Bartemius Crouch processed the paperwork himself and it has never been reviewed. Bartemius Crouch, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. A man whose commitment to catching dark wizards had, during the war, outrun his commitment to checking whether he'd caught the right ones. Remus folded McGonagall's letter and put it in the iron box that had come with him from Edinburgh, the one that held the copy of the will and the pink pebble from Harry's first afternoon on the hillside and, now, a strip of parchment with 4 words on it. He started making notes. He was not a trained investigator. He was a former student, a briefly employed teacher, a man who'd spent 3 years during the war doing things for the order that he was not going to write down anywhere. But he was thorough, and he was patient, and he had been friends with both Sirius Black and Peter Pettigrew for 14 years and knew them the way you know the inside of your own house, every dark corner, every creaking floorboard, every room that had 2 meanings. Sirius would not have done it. He'd been pushing that thought away for 6 weeks because the alternative, that Sirius had done it, was easier to hold. Easier because it had logic, and because grief needs somewhere to put its anger, and because if Sirius was guilty then the loss made a kind of horrible sense. But alone in the cottage at night while Harry slept, working through it with the cold honesty of someone who has finally stopped running from a thought, he kept arriving at the same place. Sirius would not have done it. Not because Sirius was perfect. Sirius was not perfect, was in fact a remarkably imperfect person with a temper and blind spots and the occasional catastrophically bad judgment. But there were things Sirius would not do, and betraying James Potter was structurally impossible. It would have required Sirius to be a different person than the one Remus had known, not just in values but in the deep specific architecture of who he was. Sirius loved James with the absolute completeness of someone who had been saved by a person and built their life around that fact. Which left Peter. Small, nervous Peter, who had actually been perfectly placed within the Order of the Phoenix. Who had never called attention to himself. Whose nervousness had always been attributed to temperament rather than guilt. Who had died in a Muggle street in circumstances that produced 1 finger and 12 dead bystanders, which was a very clean way to die if you were staging a death, and a very dramatic way to disappear. He wrote more notes. He also wrote a letter to a Muggle private investigator in London, because some things were better investigated in the Muggle world first, where no one was watching for magical inquiries. January came in cold and purposeful. Harry started walking properly on the 5th of January, not the experimental lurching he'd been doing since December, but actual walking, the full commitment, crossing the kitchen floor with his arms out like small wings for balance and his face wearing the expression of someone attempting something they've decided is now beneath their dignity to fail at. Remus watched him from the kitchen table and felt the specific sensation of time moving, not slowly, not quickly, but steadily, and without his permission, the way time always moves when you're watching something grow. "All right," Remus said. "Very good. Don't run yet." Harry ran. He fell over immediately, on the flagstone that they both knew perfectly well was loose, and sat on the floor and looked at the flagstone with an expression that was more offense than hurt. "I did tell you," Remus said. Harry looked up at him. Then he got up and walked back to the other side of the kitchen with the focused dignity of someone who has decided the previous incident does not count. Snape arrived that month for the 2nd round of Wolfsbane and stayed for dinner, which he did not ask to do but did not refuse when Remus produced it, sitting at the kitchen table with the wary efficiency of someone who is not accustomed to sitting at kitchen tables eating stew but has decided to allow the experience. Harry climbed onto the chair beside him and watched him eat with naked scientific interest until Snape said, without looking up from his bowl, "What?" Harry pointed at Snape's spoon. "It's a spoon," Snape said. Harry pointed at Snape's bowl. "It's stew," Snape said. "It's adequate." "It's good," Remus said mildly. "Adequate," Snape maintained. Harry said something. It was getting easier to understand Harry's communications. He had a working vocabulary now of perhaps 20 words that he deployed with surgical precision, and what he said was clearly intended to be an opinion on the stew, and it was clearly positive, and Snape looked at him for a moment and then looked back at his bowl and continued eating. Adequate, Snape said again, but quieter. After dinner, while Remus was washing up, he heard from the sitting room the sound of Harry's cardboard animal book being turned slowly, page by page, and Snape's voice naming each animal in a flat, precise, completely uninflected tone: sheep, horse, cow, pig, and Harry repeating them with varying degrees of accuracy in the specific voice children use when they are learning that words are real things with weight to them. Remus kept his back to the sitting room and washed the bowls very carefully and did not make any kind of comment about this, which was the correct thing to do and which cost him some effort. The Muggle private investigator's report arrived on the 19th of January, and 2 days later something broke open. The investigator had found a witness, a Muggle shopkeeper who had been working late on the night of the 2nd of November and whose statement had never been taken because no one had thought to ask him anything. His shop was on the corner of the street where Peter had died. He had looked out his window at the sound of the explosion. He had seen a man in a black coat running away. Running away, not blown apart. Running, and then, here the witness grew uncertain, describing things that had no Muggle vocabulary. Going, he said. Just going, like he wasn't there anymore. Remus read this and felt the cold certainty of it settle into his bones. Peter had disapparated. He'd cut off his own finger, small price, surgical and planned, created an explosion that killed 12 Muggles, and disapparated. Leaving Sirius surrounded by smoke and bodies and the grief-shattered evidence of what looked, perfectly, like guilt. Leaving Sirius, who would have stood there and not run, because Sirius never ran from anything, which was both his best quality and his most exploitable weakness. Peter was alive. Which meant Sirius was innocent. Which meant Sirius was in Azkaban for something he didn't do, had been there for 2.5 months in a prison with no appeal and no review, surrounded by Dementors, for a crime that was Peter Pettigrew's. Remus sat very still at the kitchen table for a long time. Harry came to him eventually, walking with the new confidence of someone 3 weeks into proper bipedalism, and put both hands on Remus's knee and looked up at his face with the attentive gravity of someone reading a room. "I'm all right," Remus said. Harry continued to look at him. "I'm working something out," Remus said. "Something important." Harry climbed onto his lap with the determination of someone who has assessed a situation and decided physical presence is the appropriate response, and sat there, and Remus put one arm around him and sat with the weight of what he knew and what it meant and what he was going to have to do next. He wrote 3 letters that evening after Harry went to bed. The first to Augusta Longbottom: "I have evidence that requires urgent attention at the level of the Wisengamot. Not a subcommittee. The full body. I need a meeting before the end of the month." The second to McGonagall: "I need Dumbledore to know what I know before I take it to the Wisengamot, because he deserves that, and because he has resources I don't. Please arrange a meeting at the cottage." The third he didn't send. He wrote it and held it in his hands for a long time and then folded it and put it in the iron box, a letter to Sirius, because Sirius couldn't receive it and because writing it needed doing anyway. "I know," the letter said. "I'm coming." The wards registered a presence at 2 in the morning on the 23rd of January, and Remus was out of bed and at the window with his wand before he was fully awake. It was a different quality of arrival than Dumbledore's had been. Not someone standing politely at the boundary and waiting. This was something that had found the cottage by something other than knowledge, something following a thread, or a feeling, or the specific magical resonance that people leave in places they love, which doesn't quite fade. And the shape at the end of the track, in the dark, was wrong. Too low. 4-legged. A dog. Remus stood very still at the window. The dog was large and black and thin, shockingly thin, the way a person is thin after months of almost nothing, the kind of thin that speaks of deliberate survival rather than living. It was standing at the edge of the cottage's outer ward with its nose up, reading the air, and even from this distance Remus could see the bones of it, the starved architecture of it, and the eyes that caught the moonlight in a way that was not entirely animal. He stood there for a long moment. Then he went downstairs. He opened the front door and walked down the track in his coat over his pajamas, wand in his hand, and stopped 6 feet from the dog and looked at it, and the dog looked at him. "Sirius," he said. The dog went very still. "I know," Remus said. "I know about Peter. I know what happened on the 2nd of November. I have a muggle witness and I have a theory about the finger, and I know you didn't." He stopped. His voice was doing something he hadn't given it permission to do. "I know." The dog stared at him. "You can change back," Remus said. "There are wards up. No one can see." Nothing happened for a moment. Then the dog seemed to fold, somehow, the shape of it shifting, the animal dimensions retracting and the human ones extending, and where the dog had been there was now a man. A man who was so thin it was difficult to look at, gray-faced, hollow-eyed, with hair that had gone lank and matted and clothes that were whatever Azkaban had given him 2.5 months ago and hadn't been changed since. He was shaking, not from cold, or not only from cold, and he was looking at Remus with an expression that had so many things in it that naming them felt like an impossible task. Remus crossed the 6 feet between them and put both arms around him. Sirius made a sound that was not a word. His arms came up and he grabbed the back of Remus's coat with both hands with the desperate grip of someone who has been holding on to nothing for a very long time and has suddenly found something solid. They stood in the dark of the Welsh lane at 2 in the morning and held on. After a while, Remus said, "Come inside. You need to eat something." "Harry," Sirius said, into Remus's shoulder. His voice was wrecked, hoarse and strange, the voice of someone who had not spoken above a whisper in months. He's upstairs asleep," Remus said. "He's perfect. He's walking." Sirius pulled back enough to look at Remus's face. His eyes were reddened and too bright, and there was something behind them that Azkaban had put there and that was going to need time and care to work through, but underneath all of it was serious, entirely and completely serious, and the fact of him being alive and present was so immense that Remus had to look away for a second to manage it. "You're sure about Peter?" Sirius said. It wasn't a question, it was a man who has been certain of something for 2.5 months and has never stopped being certain, checking that someone else has arrived at the same place. "The witness saw him running," Remus said. "He disapparated. He cut his own finger off and blew up the street and left you standing in it." Pause. "He's alive somewhere. We're going to find him." Something moved in Sirius's face, raw, enormous, too many things at once. "I stood there," he said. "I didn't, I just stood there and laughed." "Which I know why you laughed," Remus said. Sirius looked at him. "Because Peter did it," Remus said. "Peter, who we taught everything to, who was ours, who we thought we knew. Of course you laughed." The alternative was screaming, and laughing was available. He put a hand on Sirius's arm. "Come inside, Padfoot. You need food and warmth, and then we need to talk through everything, and then you need to sleep." "I broke out of Azkaban," Sirius said, with a trace of the old light in it, faint but present. "Just so you know. First person to do it." "I know," Remus said. "Very impressive. Come inside." "I want to see him first," Sirius said. "Harry. Before food or anything, I need to." "I know," Remus said again. He took Sirius upstairs quietly. The bedroom under the eaves was warm and low-lit, the small lamp casting its usual amber glow, and Harry was in the cot on his back with the rabbit and the blanket and his fist curled by his cheek and his dark hair going in 7 directions, entirely and completely asleep. Sirius stood in the doorway and looked at him. He stood there for a long time, and Remus stood just behind him and let him. Sirius's hand came up and pressed flat against the doorframe, just steadying himself, just having something solid, and he looked at the sleeping child and breathed, carefully, the breathing of someone who is managing something very large in a very small space. "The scar," he said, "barely sound." "Yes. They're saying, in the wizarding world, they're saying he did," Remus said. "We don't fully understand how. But he did." Sirius looked at Harry for another long moment. "He looks like James," he said. Voice very quiet. "He's James all the way through," Remus said. "You'll see. He's got Lily's eyes." "Yes. Everyone says that." Sirius exhaled. A long, slow, complete exhale, the exhale of 2.5 months of Azkaban, of guilt that wasn't guilt, of grief that had been compressed by Dementors into something grey and flat and unbearable. He exhaled all of it into the air of the small bedroom. Harry stirred. His head turned. His eyes opened, green, sharp, the finding gaze, and he looked at the doorway and at the unfamiliar figure standing in it, and he did what he'd done with Remus on the first night, what he did with McGonagall, with Augusta, with Snape. He looked for a long moment, taking stock with that frank steady attention. Then he lifted both arms. Sirius made a sound like he'd been hit. "May I?" he started, turning to Remus. "He's asking you to pick him up," Remus said. "I wouldn't keep him waiting if I were you." Sirius crossed the room and picked Harry up from the cot with hands that were shaking and held him the way you hold something that you thought was gone from the world, with a fierce completeness, his face pressed into the dark hair, his eyes closed. Harry grabbed his collar with the confidence of someone who has decided this is a perfectly acceptable state of affairs. "Hey," Sirius said, into Harry's hair, voice completely wrecked. "Hey. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't. I should have been there, should have." Harry put one hand against the side of Sirius's face. The same gesture he'd used with Remus on the first night. Sirius laughed. A real laugh, broken and genuine and fully alive, and Harry startled at the sound and then made a sound of his own that was absolutely an attempt at a laugh in response, and Remus stood in the doorway of the small room under the eaves and watched Sirius Black, who had broken out of Azkaban through sheer desperate love, hold James Potter's son, and felt the night rearrange itself around this moment into something that was still terrible and complicated and unfinished but was also, undeniably, right. "You're a mess," Remus told Sirius, from the doorway. "I've been in Azkaban," Sirius said. "I have notes. Downstairs. Food. Now. Harry comes with us because he won't go back down without a fuss at this point." Sirius came downstairs with Harry and sat at the kitchen table while Remus put together everything in the cottage that could be eaten at 2 in the morning, which was bread and cold stew from dinner and an apple and a significant amount of tea, and Sirius ate with the focused urgency of someone relearning that food is a thing that exists and is available, and Harry sat in his lap and watched him with the alert proprietary interest of someone who has decided that this person is theirs. Between bites, between cups of tea, they talked. Sirius talked about Azkaban, not everything, not in any kind of order, but pieces of it, the pieces that were ready to be looked at. The Dementors. The cold. The way they made you forget things you needed, how he'd held on by holding on to the knowledge that he was innocent, which the Dementors couldn't reach the same way they reached happiness, because it wasn't a feeling, it was a fact. Remus talked about the cottage, about the hearing, about the 4 words on the strip of parchment. "The owl," Sirius said. "I bribed a village owl in Scotland before I wasn't sure you'd know. I wasn't sure what you thought." A pause. "The last thing I could remember you knowing was that I was the secret keeper." "I was wrong to believe it," Remus said, directly, because Sirius deserved that directly. "I want you to know that I know I was wrong." Sirius looked at him. "You had every reason to. I had evidence. I didn't have truth. They're not always the same thing and I should know better." He met Sirius's eyes steadily. "I'm sorry." Sirius was quiet for a moment. "I understand why," he said finally. "I do. I was the one who convinced James to switch from me to Peter. I know how that looked after. He looked at Harry, who had fallen into a doze against his chest, warm and heavy. I thought of 100 ways I could have done it differently. Every day in there, I thought of one more. What made you switch? Remus asked. Not accusatory. Just the question he needed the answer to. Sirius's jaw tightened. I thought it would be cleverer. I thought, if Voldemort was coming for the secret keeper, better to have it be someone no one would suspect. Peter seemed safe. He stopped. I thought I was being smart. I thought I was protecting them by making the unexpected choice. His face did something that had grief in it and fury and the specific shape of a mistake you'll spend years learning to live inside. I thought I was protecting them. Remus nodded. You loved them, he said. You made a decision from love and it went wrong because someone you trusted wasn't who you thought he was. That's not the same as betrayal. He turned his mug on the table. Sirius. I need you to hear this. What happened to James and Lily is Peter's fault. Not yours. Not yours. Sirius looked at Harry sleeping against his chest. I'm going to find Peter, he said. Quiet, flat, certain. Not a plan yet. A fact about the future. We're going to find Peter, Remus said. Together. After we get you out of this legally. Which is the first problem? Sirius looked up. The Ministry thinks I'm a convicted murderer. The Ministry thinks a lot of things, Remus said. Some of them are even true. We need to get your case in front of the Wisengamot with the Muggle witness testimony and the forensic evidence about the explosion. I've been building it, I have most of what we need, and we need to do it before someone realizes you're here. What about Dumbledore? Remus considered this. I told McGonagall to arrange a meeting. I told him before the Wisengamot because he deserves to know, and because he has resources. But this is your life, Sirius. He doesn't get to decide how it's handled. Sirius held Remus's gaze for a moment. Then the old grin moved across his face, real and recognizable and still present underneath everything Azkaban had done, a little thinner than it used to be, a little harder won, but there. Look at you, Sirius said. When did you get formidable? November 1st, Remus said, without hesitating. Sirius looked at Harry again, the sleeping face, the lightning bolt scar, the dark hair in all its directions. Right, he said softly. November 1st. They sat in the warm kitchen for another hour, talking and not talking, the fire in the range and the lamp on the table and Harry asleep across Sirius's chest like a small determined anchor, holding him to the world. At some point Sirius said, very quietly, I kept thinking about him. In there. The Dementors take everything good, you know, but I kept thinking about him. A baby I'd never even, James used to describe him and I kept thinking about what he said. Dark hair. Green eyes. Laughs at everything. Completely unbothered by things that ought to bother him. He paused. I kept thinking about that. A kid who's unbothered. Couldn't reach that one. Couldn't take it. Harry stirred in his sleep and grabbed Sirius's shirt collar. Yeah, Sirius said, very quietly, to the top of Harry's head. I know, mate. I know. Outside the cottage, the January night was very cold and very dark and very still. Inside, the fire burned and the lamp made its amber circle and two people who had lost everything sat at a kitchen table in a house that belonged to the child sleeping between them, and the shape of the future, which had been entirely dark for 2.5 months, had something in it now that was not yet light but was the specific quality of dark that comes just before it. Chapter 5. The shape of proof. The problem with having Sirius Black in the cottage was that Sirius Black was, technically, an escaped convict. This was not an abstract problem. It had practical dimensions that Remus mapped out in the first 48 hours with the systematic attention he gave to anything that could blow up in his face. The Ministry would be looking, not aggressively, not yet, because Azkaban had never had an escapee before and the institution was operating on the assumption that escape was impossible, which meant the search was probably being conducted with the confused energy of people who don't fully believe in what they're doing. But it wouldn't stay that way. Eventually someone senior would make the thing official, put orders on it, start methodically working through the places Sirius might have gone. The cottage's wards helped. Remus reinforced them in the first morning after Sirius's arrival, layering new protections over the old, and Sirius, who had always been good at defensive magic, had always had the natural talent that James and Remus had developed through effort, added his own, moving around the cottage perimeter with his wand and the kind of focused silence that meant someone doing something they actually know how to do. Harry followed him around the perimeter. This became, within 2 days, simply a thing that happened. Wherever Sirius went, Harry went. Not clingingly, Harry was not a clingy child, had James's self-possession about space, but with the comfortable certainty of someone who has decided that this person is where the interesting things are. Sirius, for his part, adapted to this with a speed that suggested the universe had always intended them to be in proximity. He talked to Harry constantly, a running commentary on everything he was doing, every charm he was casting, every room he walked through, and Harry listened with his stock-taking expression and contributed single precise words at intervals that were sometimes responsive and sometimes entirely their own thing. By day 3, Harry had added Pafou to his vocabulary. Sirius, upon hearing this, sat down on the kitchen floor and said nothing for approximately 30 seconds with the expression of someone absorbing something very large. Then he said, yeah. That's right, actually. That's me. It's a reasonable approximation, Remus said, from behind his notes. It's perfect, Sirius said. It really isn't, Remus said, but without looking up because he was occupied and also because it was a little bit perfect. Harry said it again, testing the sound, Pafou, and Sirius looked at him with the expression that had been becoming more frequent and less complicated over the days since his arrival, still raw in places, still marked by 2.5 months of Azkaban in ways that Remus could see and that Sirius was managing with the stubborn pragmatism of someone who has decided that being functional is more urgent than being healed. But increasingly present. Increasingly himself. The nightmares were regular. Remus heard them through the wall of the room they'd made up for Sirius from the cottage's small study, not screaming, just the sounds of someone caught in something, the movement and sharp breathing and then the particular quality of silence afterward that meant awake and managing. Remus didn't knock. He left the lamp in the hallway on, which he hadn't mentioned, and Sirius hadn't mentioned either, but which was there and which was something. The investigation was moving. The Muggle witness statement was solid. Remus had read it enough times to know it would survive legal scrutiny, and the investigator, a practical woman named Carver who had the demeanor of someone who has learned not to be surprised by anything, had taken a follow-up statement and gotten it notarized and delivered in triplicate. It described, in the flat factual language of an eyewitness who saw what he saw, a man running and then not being there anymore, and that detail, not being there anymore, was the crack in the Ministry's version of events through which everything else could be pried open. But a Muggle witness statement wasn't enough. Not alone. Not for the Wizengamot. They needed magical evidence. The scene, Sirius said, on the 4th evening, sitting at the kitchen table across from Remus's spread of notes with Harry in his lap and a mug of tea going cold beside him. Did anyone do a thorough residue analysis of the scene on the street? Not that I can find, Remus said. The Aura report is 3 pages and mostly about confirming deaths. Because they thought they had their man, Sirius said flatly. Yes. The explosion. Sirius turned his mug slowly. Peter did it with a single spell, confringo, probably, or something in that family. And he cut his finger off with, I don't know what, he had time to plan, something surgical. He paused. Confringo leaves a signature. Every spell leaves a signature. The wand that cast it, the specific magical signature of the caster, it's in the residue, if the residue was ever preserved. The scene is 8 weeks old, Remus said. In a Muggle street. Residue doesn't wash out that fast, Sirius said. Not from a blast that size. It goes into the stonework, the ground. It sits there. He looked at Remus. I know people who know how to read residue. Pre-Azkaban, I worked with a forensic analyst named Perkins in the Horror Corps before I went into field work. He's retired now, but he still consults. He's thorough and he's not political. Can you contact him? Remus asked. Without flagging that I'm out of prison. Sirius considered. You contact him. As a private inquiry. You're Harry's legal guardian, you have standing to request an independent investigation into the circumstances surrounding the death of Harry's parents. It's not even technically about me. It's about James and Lily. He paused. Frame it that way. Remus looked at him. What? Sirius said. Nothing, Remus said. You're right. That's good. I spent 2.5 months with nothing to do but think, Sirius said. I had a lot of practice. He said it without bitterness, just as a fact. Harry patted his hand. Remus wrote to Perkins that night. Dumbledore came on the 6th day. Not unannounced, he'd written ahead, a brief note, the equivalent of a formal request. I understand there are developments. I would like to discuss them. I will come whenever is convenient. Which was Dumbledore's way of saying he knew Sirius was there, which was not surprising because Dumbledore knew most things, and that he was choosing to be courteous about it rather than bringing the ministry down on the cottage, which said something about where he stood. Remus wrote back, tomorrow at 10. He told Sirius. Sirius's jaw went tight. He'll want to manage it, he said. I know. He'll have a plan, some careful, reasonable, long-game plan that protects me eventually but on his timeline and his terms and with him in the center of it. He looked at the table. He has a lot to answer for. Leaving Harry at Privet Drive. Not pushing for a proper investigation in November. His voice had an edge on it. Letting them put me in Azkaban without a trial. I know, Remus said again. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking you to be in the room. Sirius was quiet. He's not our enemy, Remus said. He's something harder to deal with than an enemy. He's a person who's almost always right about the big things and sometimes catastrophically wrong about the small ones, and who has never fully understood that the small ones are people. Sirius looked at Harry on the floor, building the block tower. Yeah, he said. All right. Dumbledore arrived at 10 precisely. He came in and looked at the cottage, really looked at it, the way he looked at things, with the full weight of his attention, and then he looked at Sirius. The two of them regarded each other across the kitchen for a moment that had a lot of history in it, and then Dumbledore said, with complete simplicity, I am sorry, Sirius. For all of it. Sirius said nothing for a moment. You could have investigated, he said. In November. You have resources that dwarf the ministry. You could have, yes, Dumbledore said. I could have, and I didn't, and I have no satisfying explanation for that failure except that I moved too fast toward the next problem and not slowly enough through the one in front of me. He sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, which was either presumption or the habit of very old men who have run out of time for ceremony. I was wrong. Harry walked to the kitchen table and stood beside Dumbledore's chair and looked up at him. Dumbledore looked down at Harry. Harry held up the block he was carrying. Dumbledore accepted it with both hands. Thank you, Harry. Harry considered him for a moment longer, in the manner of one who reserves final judgment, and then walked back to the tower. He likes you, Sirius said, with the tone of someone who finds this mildly inconvenient. Children generally do, Dumbledore said, and there was something warm in his eyes that was not performance. Then he set the block on the table and folded his hands and looked between Remus and Sirius. Tell me what you have. They told him. He listened with the absolute quality of attention that was one of his genuine gifts, not performing listening but actually doing it, the kind of listening that takes in what's said and what's underneath it and what's being held back. He didn't interrupt. He asked one clarifying question about the Muggle witness, two about the forensic residue theory, and none about Sirius's escape, which was tactful in a way that was also strategic, since it meant he wasn't formally aware of the escape in any way that he'd need to report. When they finished, he sat with it for a moment. "Perkins will find the residue," he said. "I'm confident of that, because I believe the residue is there to find, and I also believe what I'm hearing from both of you. What I'm less confident about is the Wisengamot's appetite for revisiting this case." He looked at Remus. Bartemius Crouch processed Sirius's arrest personally. He is a man of considerable pride and considerable influence. Admitting that his department imprisoned an innocent man without trial will require either extraordinary evidence or extraordinary pressure, and even then he'll resist. "We'll have the evidence," Remus said. "You'll need more than Perkins and a Muggle witness," Dumbledore said. "You'll need something that makes the truth undeniable enough that even Crouch can't maneuver around it." He paused. "You need Peter." "We need to find Peter," Sirius said. "Yes." Dumbledore looked at the middle distance. "Peter Pettigrew is clever in a way that people consistently underestimate. He has always hidden in plain sight. He survived the war by being invisible, not hidden, not absent, but present in a way that nobody looked at directly." He paused. "He'll be doing the same thing now. Living in the Muggle world, most likely, or very close to it. He'd be a fool to re-enter the wizarding world where he could be recognized." "He's an animagus," Sirius said. "Unregistered. He transforms into a rat." Dumbledore's expression shifted. "That's not in any record." "No," Sirius said. "We kept it between us." A pause. "Me and James and Remus and Peter. We worked it out in our 5th year." He looked at the table. "James was a stag. I'm a dog. Peter's a rat." Silence in the kitchen. Remus thought about this. A rat. Small, unobtrusive, capable of living anywhere, eating anything, going unnoticed in any human space almost indefinitely. A perfect hiding place. A perfect long-term survival strategy. "He could be anywhere," Remus said. "He could be anywhere," Sirius agreed. "But he's a coward. Genuine cowards don't go far from what's familiar. He'll be somewhere he knows, or close to it." He turned his mug. "He grew up in Devon. His mother's house is in Ottery St. Catchpole. You think he's nearby?" Remus said. "I think he's comfortable somewhere he can reach Devon in under a day if he needs to feel safe." He paused. "And I think, this is a guess, but it's an educated one, I think he's with a wizarding family. As their rat. A pet. It's the safest place to be, close enough to the magical world to know what's happening, invisible enough that no one looks at you twice." Remus sat with this. "We can't search every wizarding family in the south of England," he said. "We don't have to," Sirius said. "We need to make him come to us." He looked at Remus. "What happens to Peter if I'm exonerated? What does he lose?" "His safety," Remus said. "His death story. If you're proven innocent, the official story collapses and suddenly Peter Pettigrew is a man who faked his own death and framed someone for murder." He paused. "He'd run. He'd need to run somewhere new, somewhere no one knows him. And if he runs," Sirius said, "he changes shape." "He moves," Remus said, following the logic. "Which means he can be tracked. A rat moving in a hurry in the magical world, going across the country, leaves a different kind of trace than a rat sitting still," Sirius said. "Yes." They both looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking at Sirius with an expression that was recalibrating again, the look of a man who thought he'd assessed a situation fully and has been shown a room he missed. "You worked this out in Azkaban?" he said. "I had time," Sirius said, without inflection. You were an Auror, Dumbledore said, very quietly, more to himself than to Sirius. I forget that. I always think of you as James's. He stopped. Forgive me. I have a tendency to keep people in the place I first knew them. Yes, Sirius said. You do. A brief, honest silence. I can set a monitoring charm on unregistered animagus movement, Dumbledore said. I have access through the Order's network to monitoring spells that the Ministry doesn't know exist. If a rat with magical signature moves a significant distance in a short time, in the relevant area, the charm will flag it. He looked at Sirius. But we need to move on the Wizengamot case first. The exoneration has to happen before Peter knows it's happening, or he'll be gone before the charm is even set. Which means we go to Augusta Longbottom, Remus said. Which means you go to the full Wizengamot, Dumbledore said. I will speak on Sirius's behalf. He looked at both of them. I know how much weight that statement carries and I intend to use every gram of it. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. The complicated history between them, Dumbledore's failures, Sirius's bitterness, the whole landscape of things that should have been different, was all there, none of it resolved. But Sirius was, underneath everything, a practical man when practicality was what the moment needed. Right, he said. All right. Perkins arrived at the end of January. He was a compact, unhurried man in his late 60s with the hands of someone who'd spent a career handling delicate things and the eyes of someone who had never been particularly interested in politics. He listened to Remus's briefing with minimal expression, asked questions that were specific and technical, accepted the case file Remus had assembled, and said he would go to the street in London and see what the stonework had to say. He came back 4 days later with a report that was 40 pages long and written in the dense notation of specialist analysis, which Remus read twice in full and which said, in plain summary, the explosion was caused by a single wide-field blasting curse of unusual power, cast from wand position approximately 2 meters north of the blast center. The magical signature of the caster is distinct and preserved in the stonework. A separate, smaller cutting curse was cast from the same position approximately 3 seconds prior. Both signatures are consistent with a single caster, right-handed, casting defensively. Neither signature matches the sample wand signature on file for Sirius Black, which has been compared using the standard Ministry wand registry. Neither signature matched Sirius's wand. Remus read that sentence and read it again. Then he sent his Patronus to Augusta Longbottom with one line, "We're ready." The Wizengamot hearing was scheduled for the 14th of February, which was a date that would have made Sirius say something irreverent in other circumstances and which under these circumstances he simply noted with the focused energy of someone who has been pointing at a target for 3 months and is finally being allowed to move. The night before, the cottage was quiet in a way that had texture to it, the specific quiet of people who have said everything that needs saying and are now simply present with each other and with what tomorrow means. Harry was asleep. The lamp was on low. Remus was at the kitchen table going through the documentation one final time, not because anything had changed but because thoroughness was how he managed anxiety. Sirius was sitting across from him, not reading, not doing anything in particular, just sitting in the way of someone who has learned in a very hard school how to wait. "What are you thinking?" Remus said, without looking up. "That James would be completely insufferable about all of this," Sirius said. Remus looked up. "He'd have done the whole thing in a week," Sirius said. "Sorted the will, collected Harry, had the Wizengamot hearing, found Peter, wrapped it all up. He'd be very casual about it. Very oh yes, well, it needed doing." A pause. "And Lily would have rolled her eyes and also done 3 of the actual hard parts without telling anyone." "Yes," Remus said. "I keep thinking about what they'd say," Sirius said. "About how it's gone. About," he gestured at the kitchen, the cottage, the general situation. "You and me and Harry. What do you think they'd say?" Sirius turned his mug. "James would say it was always going to be this way. That of course it was us. He always thought we were more capable than we thought we were. He paused. Lily would say she's glad it's us, and also she'd have 7 specific criticisms about the diet and the sleeping schedule and the flagstone. He looked at the loose stone in the hallway. She'd have fixed the flagstone day 1. I know, Remus said. I keep meaning to. It's a reference point, Sirius said. Harry knows exactly where it is now. It's part of the house. He looked at it for a moment. Leave it. Remus looked at the flagstone. Then he nodded once. What happens to us after? Sirius asked. After tomorrow, assuming tomorrow goes the right way. What's the plan? You're in the will, Remus said. You're the primary guardian. You're exonerated, you're Harry's legal parent, you can actually be a person in the world again. He paused. What do you want to happen? Sirius was quiet for a moment. I don't know. I haven't let myself think about after in a very long time because after kept being something that might not exist. He looked at his hands. I want to stay here. For a while. Is that all right? This is Harry's house, technically. This is our house, Remus said. As long as we need it. Sirius nodded slowly. The thinness was still there, he'd gained back something in the 3 weeks at the cottage but Azkaban had made withdrawals that would take longer to repay, but the quality of him had shifted, had been shifting daily, the animation coming back into his face like a tide coming in. He was still not himself entirely but he was increasingly in the direction of himself, which was what mattered. Moony, he said. Remus looked up. Thank you, Sirius said. Simply, completely, without the armoring layer of humor he usually put over things he meant. For knowing. For finding the evidence. For all of it. You'd have done it for me, Remus said. Obviously, Sirius said. But I didn't have to. You did. Remus held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at his documents. Go to sleep, Padfoot. We have a long day tomorrow. Sirius didn't move. One more thing. What? The letter, Sirius said. In your iron box. The one you wrote me in November and never sent. He paused. I know it's there. I saw the box. Remus was very still for a moment. What do you know about what's in it? He said. Nothing, Sirius said. I didn't open it. I just know there's a letter with my name on it that's been in that box for 3 months. He met Remus's eyes. Whatever it says, I want you to know it goes both ways. Silence in the warm kitchen. Go to sleep, Remus said again, quietly. Sirius went. Remus sat at the kitchen table alone for a while, listening to the cottage settle around him, the creak of the old wood, the wind on the Welsh hills, Harry breathing steadily upstairs in the room under the eaves. The whole weight of 3.5 months bearing down on this one pivot point, this one day tomorrow when the truth got to be the truth in front of everyone. He closed the folder of documents. He went upstairs and checked on Harry, sleeping, rabbit, fist, lightning bolt, the whole perfect inventory, and stood in the doorway for a moment the way he did every night, just making sure. Then he went to bed and slept, genuinely and without nightmares, for the first time in a very long time. The 14th of February was clear and cold, the sky a hard winter blue, no clouds, the kind of day that felt like a statement. They flew to the ministry at 9, Remus, Sirius, Harry, Sharpfang walking slightly ahead of all of them with the pre-battle composure of someone who considers legal procedure a form of combat, and walked through the atrium together. The atrium was busy. It was always busy. But the busy stopped, in patches, as they moved through it. Word traveled fast in the magical world, it always had, faster than any muggle communication technology, through the networks of relationship and gossip and shared magical awareness that connected everyone who lived in this world, and whether word had traveled about the hearing or simply about the fact of Sirius Black standing in the ministry atrium, in a coat that was not Azkaban gray, with Harry Potter on his hip. Something rippled through the atrium ahead of them. People stopped. People stared. People moved out of the way not from fear but from something else, the instinct of a crowd that senses it is watching a moment that will be talked about afterward. Sirius walked through all of it without slowing, without looking sideways, head up, the old quality of him, the bright burning confidence that Azkaban had dimmed but not extinguished, coming back to full brightness in the clear blue light of the atrium. Harry looked at the people looking at him and pointed at a golden fountain. "Yes," Sirius said. "That's a fountain. We'll look at it after." "Puffu," Harry said, with authority. "Yes," Sirius said. "That's me. We've established that." They walked into the lift, the four of them and the goblin, and the lift descended, and Remus felt the day gather itself around them with the quality of something that has been building for a long time and is now, finally, arriving. He thought of James with ink on his hand and a laughing complaint about Quidditch. He thought of Lily pressing a cup of tea at him in a doorway. He thought of a feeding schedule tucked in a pocket, and a pink pebble on a hillside, and a strip of parchment with 4 words on it, and Sirius's hands grabbing the back of his coat in the dark lane and not letting go. The lift stopped. The doors opened. The Wizengamot chamber was full. Chapter 6. What James left the full Wizengamot chamber was a different thing entirely from the subcommittee room. It had the weight of centuries in it, the tiered stone seating rising in a horseshoe above the floor, 50-odd witches and wizards in plum-colored robes already present and settling, the low sound of conversation that dropped incrementally as Remus and Sirius walked through the doors. The chamber had tried people for serious crimes. It had made decisions that changed the shape of the magical world. It understood its own gravity and communicated this through architecture alone, the height of the ceiling, the quality of the silence between voices, the way sound carried with the specific honesty of a room that has no good acoustics for whispering. Remus had been here once before, during the war, giving testimony in an order capacity. He remembered finding it impressive in an abstract way. Today it was simply the arena they needed, and he walked through it with his documents and his certainty and Harry on his other arm, and found the respondents' table and sat down. Sirius sat beside him. For a moment, before the formal proceedings opened, Remus felt the chamber looking at Sirius. 50 witches and wizards who had been told a story about this man for 3.5 months, told it by the Daily Prophet and the Ministry and the accumulated confidence of institutional certainty, and here he was, sitting at a table in a clean coat with James Potter's son in his lap, calmly sorting through documents, and the story and the man were not matching up in ways that the chamber was beginning to feel. Bartemius Crouch entered from a side door. He was a tall, angular man with a clipped mustache and the posture of someone who has never once in his professional life been publicly wrong. He was head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and he moved through the chamber with the efficiency of ownership, which was how he always moved, which was how a man moved when he had decided a long time ago that the law was a thing he administered rather than answered to. He looked at Sirius. Sirius looked back at him without expression. Crouch looked away first, which said something. The Wizengamot chief warlock, an elderly wizard named Ulfric Sable whom Remus did not know personally but who Augusta had described as scrupulously fair and irretrievably slow, called the chamber to order. He outlined the purpose of the hearing in the manner of someone reading a document they have already memorized, which he had, and which he read anyway because procedure was the skeleton everything else hung from. The formal purpose, a challenge to the conviction of Sirius Orain Black, brought by his legal representative under Section 14 of the Wizengamot Charter, which allowed for the review of any conviction obtained without proper trial. Supplementary to this, the examination of new evidence pertaining to the deaths of James and Lily Potter on the night of October 31, 1981, and the events of November 2 on Magnolia Street, Clapham. Crouch was on his feet before Sable finished. The conviction is a matter of record, he said, with the specific energy of someone who has been building a response since the moment the hearing was announced. The evidence at the time was unambiguous, the evidence at the time was unexamined, Remus said, clearly, without raising his voice. Crouch looked at him. The look carried about 40 years of seniority and a complete lack of interest in being contradicted by someone of Remus's approximate institutional weight, which was approximately none. "You are?" Crouch said. "Remus Lupin. I'm Harry Potter's legal guardian and Sirius Black's designated representative for this proceeding." He slid a document across the table toward the center of the chamber. "Sharpfang of Gringotts is also present as legal counsel." Sharpfang, seated to Remus's left, inclined his head precisely 3 degrees in the manner of someone who considers this acknowledgement slightly beneath his professional dignity but will accept it. Crouch turned to the chief warlock. "I object to the framing. The arrest was, Mr. Crouch." Sable's voice was mild and absolutely immovable. "You'll have your opportunity to respond. Let the evidence be heard first." Crouch sat down. His jaw was tight. He had the posture of a man containing something. Remus stood. He had thought about how to do this, not theatrically, not with the rhetorical architecture of someone trying to perform convincingness. He didn't have the instinct for performance that Sirius had, or James's easy command of a room. What he had was the evidence, and the 3 facts Augusta had given him 2 months ago, and the truth, which was the most powerful thing in the room and which didn't need decoration. On the 2nd of November, 1981, he said, Sirius Black was arrested for the murders of 12 muggles and the alleged murder of Peter Pettigrew on Magnolia Street in Clapham. He was taken to Azkaban within 36 hours. There was no trial. He let that sit for a moment. "No trial," he said again. "Not a hearing like this one. Not a formal examination of evidence. Not a single witness questioned, a single spell analyzed, a single alternative theory considered. A man was sent to Azkaban for life without being allowed to speak in his own defense." He looked around the chamber. "I want this body to hold that fact clearly in mind while we go through the evidence, because everything else I'm about to tell you sits on top of that foundation. Everything else is detail. That is the bedrock." Several members of the chamber shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward. Some looked at Crouch. Crouch was looking at a point 6 inches above Remus's head. Remus presented the case in order. First, Perkins's forensic report. He walked through it methodically, the magical signature analysis, the fact that neither the blasting curse nor the cutting curse matched Sirius's wand signature, the precise technical language from the report made accessible without being dumbed down. He had copies distributed to every Wisengamot member by the clerk, and he gave them 30 seconds to register the key finding before he moved on. Neither signature matches the sample wand signature on file for Sirius Black. Several members of the chamber were already exchanging glances. Crouch raised a hand. The report was commissioned by an interested party. The report was produced by Arnold Perkins, Remus said, who served the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for 32 years and whose forensic methodology is cited in the ministry's own training manuals. The independence of his analysis is established by his professional record. He looked at Crouch directly. "Has the department run its own forensic analysis of the scene?" A pause. "The evidence at the time," Crouch began. "Has the department run its own forensic analysis?" Remus said again. The pause was longer this time. "No," Crouch said. The word came out with the specific quality of something expensive. The chamber's temperature changed. Remus moved to the second element, the Muggle witness. Carver had prepared a clean summary version of her report for this purpose, 2 pages, the eyewitness account rendered in plain language, notarized, with a supplementary page explaining Muggle witness credibility and why a man who doesn't know the difference between disapparition and walking through a door would have no motivation to describe a man running away and then not being there anymore unless that was what he saw. He let the chamber read it. Then he made the argument about Peter. This was the part that could have been sensational and which he deliberately chose not to make sensational. He laid it out factually. Peter Pettigrew had been a member of the Order of the Phoenix. He had been a close friend of James and Lily Potter and of Sirius Black. He had been the secret keeper for the Fidelius charm protecting the Potters, not Sirius, who had convinced James to switch to Peter precisely because Peter was unexpected, precisely because Sirius thought the more obvious choice would draw the danger. On the 2nd of November, according to one sworn Muggle eyewitness, a man had fled the site of the explosion in Clapham before disapparating. The forensic evidence confirmed that the spells at the scene were not cast by Sirius's wand. Peter Pettigrew was an unregistered animagus, a rat, which explained both the ease of his disappearance and the method of his survival. He paused here and looked around the chamber. "The evidence before you," he said, "does not require you to make a complicated decision. It requires you to make the decision the law demands you make when the evidence of innocence is this clear." He gathered his documents. "That is all." He sat down. The chamber was very quiet. Harry, who had been in Sirius's lap for the duration of this and had been extraordinarily patient, chose this moment to say something clear and decisive that was recognizably the word "done," which produced a ripple of something through the chamber, not quite laughter, but the release of tension that was its near neighbor. Sirius looked down at him. "Very nearly," he said quietly. Crouch was on his feet. He was controlled, Remus would give him that. He was a man who had built a career on never losing control of a room, and he did not lose it now, even though the ground under him had been demonstrably moving since Remus stood up. He challenged the forensic report's methodology on technical grounds that were detailed and sometimes valid. He questioned the Muggle witness's ability to accurately describe magical events. He pointed out that the animagus claim was unverifiable and had no documentation. He was thorough and he was smart, and he was absolutely working in the direction of a conclusion he'd already decided on, which meant that every argument he made had the quality of a defense rather than an inquiry. The chamber could feel it. Remus could feel them feeling it. And then Dumbledore stood. He'd been in the gallery until now, not on the floor, not part of the formal proceeding, simply present in the second row with his hands folded and his silver hair loose and his half-moon glasses catching the chamber light. He stood, and the chamber's attention turned to him with the specific quality of attention that only certain people command, not because he demanded it, but because he had been doing things worth paying attention to for so long that the habit was automatic. "May I address the chamber?" he said, to Sable. Sable looked at Crouch. Then back at Dumbledore. "You may." Dumbledore came down from the gallery and stood in the center of the chamber floor. He was not at the respondent's table and not at the prosecution's position. He was simply in the middle, which was a spatial choice that was also an argument about where he stood relative to the proceeding itself, not aligned with either side, above the conflict, which was where Albus Dumbledore always stood and which he was very aware communicated something. "I am here," Dumbledore said, "to tell you something I should have told you 3.5 months ago." The chamber was absolutely still. "I knew, in the days before the Potters were killed, that their secret keeper had been changed," he said. "James told me he was considering the switch, from Sirius to Peter. I advised against it." He paused. "When the Potters died and Sirius was arrested, I allowed the institutional momentum of that arrest to proceed without challenge. I had access to information that should have prompted me to demand a proper investigation. I did not demand it." He was looking at Crouch as he said this, steadily, without anger, which was more devastating than anger would have been. "I failed James and Lily Potter by not protecting them when I might have, and I failed Sirius Black by not questioning his arrest when I should have." He turned to look at Sirius. "I am sorry." Publicly, formally, and without reservation. Sirius held his gaze. Something passed between them, the complicated history, the failures, the grief, the long road from that night to this one, and Sirius nodded once. Not forgiveness, not exactly. Acknowledgement. A door left open. "The evidence presented today," Dumbledore continued, addressing the chamber again, "is consistent with what I know of both Sirius Black and Peter Pettigrew. I have known both men since they were children of 11 years old. I have watched them grow. I have worked alongside them in the most difficult circumstances imaginable." He paused. Sirius Black's presence in that Clapham Street on the 2nd of November was not the presence of a guilty man disposing of a witness. It was the presence of a man who had just understood that his closest friend had been murdered because of a decision he made, and who was standing in the wreckage of that understanding. The chamber was so quiet that the ventilation in the ceiling was audible. "Peter Pettigrew," Dumbledore said, and his voice had something in it that was not quite what it usually was, something more tired, more honest, the voice of a man who has been wrong and knows it and is choosing not to perform certainty he doesn't have, was a more sophisticated actor than any of us gave him credit for. "That is on us. It is on me particularly. I am supposed to see clearly, and I did not see him clearly, and people I loved died for it." He returned to the gallery and sat down. The silence he left behind had the texture of sediment. Everything that had been suspended in the water of the proceeding was settling toward the bottom, and the bottom was becoming visible, and what was at the bottom was the truth. Crouch made one more attempt. He was professional about it. He submitted a formal objection to the admissibility of the forensic report, questioned the standard of evidence required under Article 14, requested a recess to assemble a counter-analysis. His voice was entirely controlled and entirely revealed nothing. He was very good at this. Sable listened to him with the patient attention of someone who has already made up his mind and is allowing the process its due course, which was the correct thing to do and which everyone in the room could see was happening. When Crouch finished, Sable looked at the chamber. "I would like to hear from the respondent directly," Sable said. He looked at Sirius. "Mr. Black. You are not required to speak. But you may." Sirius looked at Remus. Remus said nothing. This was Sirius's call, entirely. Sirius handed Harry to Remus and stood up. He stood in the center of the chamber floor where Dumbledore had stood, and he looked at the 50 witches and wizards looking back at him, and he said nothing for a long moment. He was not composing himself, he was deciding. You could see him deciding. "I was 22 years old," he said. "When they arrested me. I'd been awake for 2 days. I'd been to Godric's Hollow and I'd seen," he stopped. "I'd seen what was left. And I was 22 years old and I didn't ask for a lawyer because it didn't occur to me that I needed one, because I was innocent, and I thought that was obvious. I thought it would be obvious to everyone." He looked at Crouch, directly, and Crouch met his eyes for approximately 3 seconds before looking at his notes. "I was wrong about that." The chamber was listening. Not with the professional attention of people performing their function, but with the full human quality of people encountering something real. "I spent 3.5 months in Azkaban," Sirius said. "I won't tell you what that's like because the honest answer is that there aren't really words for it, and I don't want to stand here and perform my suffering for you. What I'll tell you is this: I thought about James and Lily every single day. And I thought about Harry." He looked back at Remus, at Harry in Remus's arms. Harry was watching him with the green-eyed attention that was Lily's and the expression underneath it that was James's. "I thought about Harry and I thought, if I'm in here, who has him? If I'm in here, who's telling him who his parents were? Who's keeping that alive for him?" He turned back to the chamber. "That kept me from losing myself completely. Not the injustice. Not the anger. Him. 15 months old and I'd never even met him properly, and thinking about him was what kept me." He paused. "Intact." Complete silence. "I'm not asking for your sympathy," Sirius said. "I'm asking for what the law requires when the evidence is what it is. My wand didn't cast those spells. A witness saw Peter run. The conviction was obtained without trial. Those are the facts." He looked around the chamber one final time. "That's all I've got." He sat down. Harry immediately reached for his collar. The vote was called 20 minutes later, after a brief deliberation that was, given its subject matter, remarkably short, which said its own thing about what the chamber had made of the evidence and the morning. 43 in favor of exoneration. 7 opposed. 3 abstentions. Sable read the finding in the flat ceremonial voice of a man who has read many findings and knows the weight of them. The conviction of Sirius Orion Black is hereby overturned. The record will be expunged. All associated ministry orders are rescinded with immediate effect. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement is directed to open a formal investigation into the whereabouts of Peter Pettigrew. He paused. Mr. Black. You are free. The chamber absorbed this. And then, from somewhere in the upper tiers, a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another. Then 6 more. Then 20. Not a performance, not the assembled enthusiasm of an institution congratulating itself. The specific sound of people who believed, genuinely, that something right had happened, which was not as common in the Wisengamot chamber as it should have been. Sirius sat very still and looked at the table. Remus put a hand on the back of his neck, briefly. Sirius reached up and gripped his wrist once, hard, and let go. Harry said Puffo with great authority, apparently feeling the moment called for his contribution. Several members of the chamber laughed, real laughter, the surprised kind, and the sound of it in the stone chamber broke something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. Crouch left without speaking to anyone. Remus watched him go and felt no particular triumph about it. Crouch was not a monster, was a man who had been convinced of something and had moved fast and hadn't checked, which was a human failure available to anyone. He'd been wrong, and he'd built a structure of self-belief on top of being wrong, and that structure had just publicly collapsed. What he did with that was his business. Dumbledore found them in the corridor outside the chamber, as the formal dispersal of people was happening and the ministry was doing its particular version of absorbing a significant event, which involved a lot of bureaucratic motion and at least 3 officials with clipboards moving in purposeful circles. He looked at Sirius. There's the matter of the Animagus registry, he said, with a mildness that was mostly genuine. Yours and Harry's father's, technically, though the latter is now academic. You'll want to register formally before the ministry gets to it. I know, Sirius said. And the investigation into Peter. Dumbledore set the monitoring charm last night, as agreed, he'd sent word through McGonagall. I've had no flag yet. He hasn't run. He paused. Which means he doesn't know yet. The prophet will run this tomorrow, Remus said. Yes. Which gives us today. Dumbledore looked at both of them. Be ready. He moved away through the corridor, an old man in midnight blue robes moving through the ministry with the unhurried certainty of a person who has more to do and a clear sense of how to do it. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. I'll never fully trust him, Sirius said, watching him go. No, Remus agreed. But I think he knows that now. And I think he considers it appropriate. Sirius looked at him. That's more generous than I expected from you. He spoke for you today, Remus said. In public. At genuine cost to his own institutional standing. He could have submitted a written statement. He shrugged. I'm not making him a saint. I'm just keeping the account accurate. Sirius was quiet for a moment. Then, all right. Fair. They walked through the ministry corridor together, Harry between them, the day already shifting toward afternoon, the gray February light coming through the atrium's ceiling in long cold columns that caught the dust in the air and made it briefly, incidentally beautiful. McGonagall intercepted them at the atrium fountain. She was in her traveling cloak, hat pinned, the expression she wore when she had feelings that she was managing through the exercise of composure. She looked at Sirius and the composure did something complicated. Minerva, Sirius said. His voice was warm in a way that surprised Remus slightly. In the complicated relationship between Sirius and McGonagall, warmth had been occasional and hard-won, mostly because Sirius had spent 7 years at Hogwarts being spectacularly creative about rule-breaking in ways that made her professional life more difficult. But they were here, on the other side of it, and she was here, and the warmth was real. McGonagall put a hand on his arm. One hand, firm, brief, the gesture of someone who will not make a scene in the ministry atrium and knows it. "You look terrible," she said. "I've been in Azkaban," he said. "I'm aware of that," she said. "I'm also aware that now you're not, and that you should eat something." She reached into her bag. Remus had not known she had a bag, had not known McGonagall carried a bag, and produced a paper-wrapped parcel that turned out to be sandwiches, which she pressed into Sirius's hand with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who has anticipated a practical need and met it. Sirius looked at the sandwiches for a moment. "Thank you, Professor," he said, quietly. "Don't call me Professor," she said. "You've been out of school for 5 years." She turned to Harry, and her expression did the thing it always did, the helpless softening of a woman who was professionally committed to sternness encountering something that undid it completely. "Come here," she said, and held out her arms with the practical warmth of someone who has decided the atrium is an appropriate place for this, whatever anyone thinks. Harry went to her without hesitation. He grabbed the collar of her traveling cloak with both hands and patted her cheek once, businesslike, with the flat of his hand, the gesture of someone conducting an inspection and finding results satisfactory. McGonagall pressed her cheek briefly against the top of his head and then straightened and handed him back to Sirius with the manner of someone who has done exactly what she intended to do and needs no commentary on it. "What happens now?" she said, to Remus. "We go home," Remus said. "We wait for the prophet tomorrow. We see if Dumbledore's charm flags Peter." He paused. "And at some point in the near future, we live, I think. As a general project." McGonagall looked at him. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than I've been in 4 months, he said, honestly. She studied him for a moment with the eyes that had never missed much and said, "Good. See that it continues." She touched his arm briefly, the same firm gesture she'd given Sirius. Then she pinned her hat more securely against the ministry's capricious internal air currents and walked away toward the flues. The prophet ran the story the next morning. It ran on the front page in the large font reserved for things of national significance, above a photograph of Sirius leaving the ministry that someone had taken without their noticing, Sirius walking with Harry on his hip, Remus beside him, the atrium behind them, the photo moving with the specific energy of the moment as it had happened. Sirius Black exonerated, evidence clears alleged Potter betrayer. Peter Pettigrew sought for questioning. By midday, Dumbledore's charm had flagged 3 separate rat movements in the southwest of England moving north in a pattern consistent with something that needed to get somewhere new quickly. By the following morning, the pattern had stopped. Somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, in a patch of countryside where a rat had no natural purpose being, something had gone to ground. The ministry's investigation was now active and had 2 Aurors assigned to it and, quietly, Dumbledale's monitoring network. It would take time. Peter was good at invisible. But invisible wasn't the same as gone, and he had considerably fewer resources now than he'd had a week ago, no death story, no clean narrative, no institutional assumption that the right man was already in prison. He was a wanted man in a country where the magical community was very small and very connected, and he had nowhere that was permanently safe. It would take time. But it would happen. The cottage in February was different from the cottage in November. The same stone, the same slate roof, the same Welsh hills going brown and grey in the winter, but inhabited differently, occupied with the specific quality of people who have settled into a place rather than sheltered in it. The kitchen had accumulated the evidence of 3 people living in it. The bookshelf in the sitting room had been reorganized 3 times by 3 different people with 3 different organizational philosophies and had arrived at a compromise that satisfied no one. The loose flagstone was still loose. Harry's pebble collection on the hillside had grown to 11, which Remus knew because Harry conducted a daily census. On the last day of February, a Sunday, the weather broke clean and cold and brilliant, winter sun on the snow that had come down overnight and settled on the hills in the shallow way of late-season snow that was more beautiful than Sirius. Sirius took Harry outside. Remus watched from the kitchen window while he made tea. Sirius was showing Harry the snow, not explaining it, not narrating it, just being in it with him. Crouching down and pressing his hand into the white surface and lifting Harry's hand and pressing it in two, both handprints side by side, large and small. Harry looked at his handprint in the snow with the examining the pebble expression, the full serious attention, and then looked at the hill above him and the sky above the hill and seemed to take stock of all of it, the white and the blue and the cold and the man crouching beside him, and then he made a sound that was entirely and completely a laugh, high and sudden and total, the laugh of someone who has discovered something wonderful. Sirius laughed with him. The old laugh, the real one, not the managed version but the original, the one Remus had known since they were 11 years old, full-bodied and surprised at itself. Remus stood at the kitchen window with his tea and felt the weight of 4 months, all of it, every piece of it. Every night he'd held himself together with nothing but purpose and the will and the needs of a child who deserved more than the world had given him. He felt all of it shift. Not lift entirely. Not resolve into something clean and finished. But shift, the way weight shifts when someone else takes part of it, when the load is distributed across people rather than carried alone. He thought of James. He thought of James standing in the cottage when they were 20, one summer that felt like 100 years ago, sitting on the kitchen counter eating an apple and talking about the future with the absolute confidence of someone who has no reason yet to doubt the future exists. He thought of James saying, and this was such a James thing to say, so entirely characteristic, that the memory of it was sharp-edged and exact, "Whatever happens, Mooney, we take care of each other. That's the deal. That's always been the deal. That's the deal." He had been carrying James's son for 4 months. Carrying the will and the legal battles and the grief and the long nights and the flagstone and the pebbles on the hillside and the too large sleep suit with the yellow ducks. He had picked up Harry from a yellow room in Surrey and walked out into the rain and disapparated and begun the complicated, exhausting, necessary project of not letting one more thing be taken from the people he loved. He had done it. He had done it, and Sirius was here and Harry was standing in the snow on a Welsh hillside laughing at the sky, and it was nowhere near being, the world it should have been, the world where James was alive and Lily was alive and none of this had been necessary. That world was gone and would always be gone, and the grief for it was permanent and real and would be there every day. But this world had Harry in it. Harry with his pebbles and his senses and his stock-taking gaze and his vocabulary of precise perfect words, who had reached both arms up on the first night and held on, who had given Remus a pink pebble on a hillside and called Sirius Pofu with the absolute confidence of someone naming a thing that is already theirs. This world had Sirius in it, thin and marked and increasingly himself, who had broken out of Azkaban through nothing but love and had stood in a Wisengamot chamber and said, "I thought about Harry and I thought, who's keeping that alive for him?" This world had McGonagall's sandwiches in it, and Augusta Longbottom's hat, and Snape's flat voice naming animals from a cardboard book, and a feeding schedule in a pocket, and a Muggle private investigator who had found the truth in a London street corner's stonework. This world had James in it, in every relevant way. In the will he'd written carefully. In the bequest that kept the cottage running. In Harry's nose and Harry's laugh and Harry's total unself-conscious confidence in being loved. In Remus and Sirius still being here, still choosing each other, still honoring the deal. Whatever happens, we take care of each other. Remus set down his tea and went outside. The snow was shallow and bright, the hills enormous under the winter sky, and Sirius was still crouching beside Harry with their 2 handprints side by side in the white ground. He looked up when Remus came out, and something passed between them that was not a sentence and didn't need to be, the specific communication of people who have been through something large together and arrived, improbably, on the other side. Harry looked up at Remus and held out his hand. The offering gesture. The best thing in the collection. Remus crouched beside him and looked at what Harry was holding. It was a handful of snow. Just snow, a small cold fistful of it, already beginning to melt against the warmth of Harry's hand. It was the best thing he'd found this morning, and he was giving it away with the complete and uncalculating generosity of someone who has never learned to hedge. Remus put out his hand. Harry deposited the snow into it. "Thank you," Remus said. Harry beamed. Sirius made a sound beside him that was the quiet cousin of the laugh, and Remus looked at him and Sirius looked back, and the cold air and the white hills and the small boy between them were all completely, exactly real. "Now what?" Sirius said. Remus looked down at the snow melting in his palm. He looked at Harry, who had already moved on to investigating a clump of dead grass emerging from the snow's edge with his standard professional interest. He looked at Sirius, thin and alive and here. "Now we raise him," Remus said. "That's all. That's the whole thing." "That's the whole thing," Sirius agreed. The snow on the hills caught the winter sun and gave it back in pieces, small bright pieces scattered across the white and the gray and the cold, the whole hillside briefly, quietly luminous. Harry found a pebble under the snow. He held it up, examining it. Nodded once, decisive, satisfied. Added it to his mental inventory. 12 now. Above the cottage, above the hills, the winter sky went on, clear and enormous and indifferent to all of it, in the way skies are, in the way the world keeps turning regardless, in the way time moves forward without asking permission. They went inside when Harry's hands got cold. Sirius made the tea this time, which he did in the way he did everything, with a great deal of confidence and moderate technical accuracy, and Remus fixed the minor errors without comment, and Harry sat on the kitchen floor with his 12 pebbles, arranging them into patterns with the focus of someone doing serious structural work, and the cottage was warm, and the fire was on, and the lamp on the table threw its amber light against the old stone walls the way it had thrown light in this kitchen for 70 years, against the hands of potters going back to when the world had been different and would be different again. On the floor, Harry looked up from his pebbles. He looked at Sirius. He looked at Remus. He picked up the pink one, the best one, the first one, the one from the hillside on his second day here, and considered it in his palm with great seriousness. Then he put it carefully back in the center of his arrangement. Not offering it this time. Keeping it. Placing it exactly where it belonged, in the middle of the things that mattered, in the center of everything he'd found. Safe.